Section 1 of Speeches of Prince Bismarck, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Speeches of Prince Bismarck, Part 2, by Otto von Bismarck, translated by Edmund von Mach. Salus Publica, Bismarck's only Lode-Star. February 24th, 1881. Translated by Edmund von Mach, Ph.D. On February 24th, 1881, the budget of the Empire for the ensuing year was under discussion. The representative, Mr. Richter, made use of this opportunity to attack the home politics of the Chancellor in their entirety. He felt great concern about the growing power of the Chancellor, and called upon his Liberal colleagues to stem the tide and to curb the power of the Chancellor.
Only if this is done will the great gifts which distinguished the Chancellor continue to be fruitful for Germany. If this is not possible, and if we go on as we have been going, the Chancellor will ruin himself, and he will ruin the country.
Prince Bismarck replied,
The remarks of the previous speaker have hardly touched upon the subject under discussion, the budget, since I have been here. Consequently, I am excused, I suppose, from adding anything to what the Secretary of the Treasury has said. The previous speaker has mainly concerned himself with a critique of my personality. The number of times the word Chancellor appears in his speech, in proportion to the total number of words, sufficiently justifies my assertion. Well, I do not know what is the use of this critique, if not to instruct me and to educate me. But I am in my 66th year, and in the 20th of my tenure of office. There will not be much in me to improve. You will have to use me up as I am, or push me aside. I, on my part, have never made the attempt to educate the Honourable Mr. Richter. I do not think I am called upon to do it, nor have I endeavoured to force him from his sphere of activity. I should not have the means of doing this, nor do I wish it. But I believe he, in his turn, will lack the means of forcing me from my position. Whether he will be able to compress me and circumscribe me, as toward the end of his speech he said was desirable, I do not know. I am, however, truly grateful to him for the concern he expressed about my health. Unfortunately, if I wish to do my duty, I cannot take such care of myself as Mr. Richter deems desirable. I shall have to risk my health. When he said that every evil troubling us, even the rate of interest, and I know not what else, was based on the uncertainty of our conditions, and when he quoted the word of a colleague, of a hopeless confusion, well, gentlemen, I must repeat what I have said elsewhere, and in the hearing of the Honourable Mr. Richter. Make a comparison, and look about you in other countries. If our conditions, with their ordered activities and their assured future at home and abroad, constitute a hopeless confusion, how shall we characterize the conditions of many another country? I can see no European country, a condition of safety and an assured outlook into the future, similar to that prevailing in the German Empire. I have already said on the former occasion that my position as Minister of Foreign Affairs made it impossible for me to be specific, but everyone who will follow my remarks with a map in his hand and a knowledge of the history during the past 20 years will have to say that I am right. I do not know what is the use of these exaggerations of a hopeless confusion and a lack of assurance and uncertainty of the future. Nobody in the country believes it, and isn't that the chief thing? The people in the country know perfectly well how well off they are, and all who do not fare as they wish are pleased to blame the government for it, when a candidate comes up for election and says to them, "The government," or to quote the previous speaker, "the Chancellor is to blame for all this." He may find many credulous people, but in the majority he will find people who will say, "The Chancellor surely has his faults and drawbacks, but most people will not be convinced that I am to blame for everything." I am faring in this respect like Emperor Napoleon, 12 years and more ago, who was accused, not in his own country but in Europe, as the cause of all evils, from Tartary to Spain. And he was not nearly so bad a creature as he was said to be. May I not also claim the benefit of this doubt, Mr. Richter? I, too, am not so bad as I am painted. His attack upon me, moreover, if he will stop to reflect, is largely directed not against me personally, or against that part of my activities in which I possess freedom of action. No, it is directed primarily against the constitution of the German Empire. The Constitution of the German Empire knows no other responsible officer but the Chancellor. I might assert that my constitutional responsibility does not go nearly so far as the one actually placed upon me, and I might take things a little easier and say, I have nothing to do with the home policies of the Empire, for I am only the Emperor's executive officer. But I will not do this. From the beginning I have assumed the responsibility, and also the obligation, of defending the decisions of the Bundesrat, provided I can reconcile them with my responsibility, even if I find myself there in the minority. This responsibility I will take as public opinion understands it. Nobody, however, can be held responsible for acts and resolves not his own. No responsibility can be foisted on anybody, nor did the imperial constitution intend to do this, for acts which do not depend on his own free will, and into which he can be forced. The responsible person, therefore, must enjoy complete independence and freedom within the sphere of his responsibility. If he does not, all responsibility ceases, and I do not know on whose shoulders it will rest. So far as the Empire is concerned, it has disappeared completely. As long, therefore, as Mr. Richter does not change the Constitution, you yourselves must insist on having a Chancellor who is absolutely free and independent in his decisions, for no man can hold him responsible for those things which he is unable to decide for himself, freely and independently. Mr. Richter has expressed the wish of limiting in several directions this constitutional independence of the Chancellor. In the first place, in one direction where it is already limited, and where he wishes to have it disappear entirely. This concerns his responsibility for those acts in our political life which the Constitution assigns to the Emperor in connection with the decisions of the Bundesrat and the Reichstag. There can be no doubt that these acts include also those which have to be performed, as the Constitution says, in the name of the Emperor. The submission, for instance, to the Reichstag of a resolve of the Bundesrat. Mr. Richter has correctly quoted an incident mentioned in the North German Gazette concerning the resolves on some collected cases of accidents, which I considered it incompatible with my responsibility to submit to you in the name of the Emperor. I therefore did not do it. One may well ask, what has the constitutional law to say on this point? Was I justified in not acting? Was the Emperor justified in not acting, or was His Majesty the Emperor bound by the Constitution to submit to you the resolve of the Bundesrat? At the time when the Constitution was being drawn, I once discussed this point with an astute jurist who had long been and still is with us in an important position, Mr. Pape. He said to me, "The Emperor has no veto." I replied, "Constitutionally he has not, but suppose a measure is expected of him which he thinks he should not take, and against which his then Chancellor warns him, saying, 'I cannot advocate it, and I shall not countersign it.' Well, in this case the Emperor is obliged to look for another Chancellor, and to dismiss him who opposes the measure. Is he obliged to accept anyone as Chancellor, suggested perhaps by the other party? Will he look for a second or third Chancellor, both of whom may say, 'We cannot assume the responsibility for this bill by submitting it to the Reichstag'?" Hereupon Mr. Pape replied, "You are right, the Emperor possesses an indirect but actual veto." I do not even go so far, for none of these cases are pressed to their logical conclusion. Let us, however, take a concrete case which will make these matters perfectly clear. Suppose the majority of the Bundesrat had passed a bill with the approval of Prussia, but Prussia had made the mistake of not calling upon the Prussian minister designated to instruct the Prussian delegation in the Bundesrat, or even Prussia had consented, and the minister had been present and had been in the minority also in the Prussian cabinet, and the Emperor had directed him to submit the resolves of the Bundesrat to the Reichstag, to which the Chancellor had replied, "I do not believe that I can answer for this, or that my responsibility permits me to do it." Then there results the possibility of the Emperor's saying, "If that is so, then I must look for another Chancellor." This did not happen. Another thing happened, namely, the resolve was not submitted. The ensuing situation is this, that the persons entitled to complain, if there are any, constitute the majority of the governments who passed this resolve in the Bundesrat. This points to the proper way, and I believe in weighty questions it would be taken to the end. In the present case, if one were to make a test of what is really right, the majority of the Bundesrat would have to represent to His Majesty as follows: "We have passed a resolve, and our constitutional right demands that the Emperor submit it to the Reichstag. We demand that this be done." The Emperor might reply, "I will not investigate the law of the case to see whether I am obliged to act. I will assume that I am, and I do not refuse to act, but for the present I have no Chancellor willing to countersign the order." In such a case, can the Chancellor be ordered to sign because he shall and must do so? Can he be threatened with imprisonment, as is done with recalcitrant witnesses? What would then become of his responsibility? If the Chancellor continues to refuse, the majority of the Bundesrat may say to the Emperor, "You must dismiss this Chancellor and get another. We insist that our resolve be laid before the Reichstag. If this is not done, the Constitution will be broken." Well, gentlemen, why not wait and see whether this will happen, and whether those entitled to complain will take this course, and, if they do, whether His Majesty the Emperor will not be ready to say after all, "All right, I shall try to find a Chancellor who is willing to submit the resolve." I shall, of course, not enter here upon a discussion of the reasons which determined me in this concrete case. They were reasons not found in the shut-in offices, but in God's open country, and they induced me to deem the enactment of this law undesirable. I did not possess the certainty that a majority of this House would have seen the impossibility of carrying out the law, but I did not wish to expose the country to danger. It was a danger, according to my way of thinking, of getting this law. The only moment when I could guard against this danger was when the law was to be submitted in the name of the Emperor. The constitutional remedy against such a use of an opportunity is a change of chancellors. I can see no other remedy. Mentioning the Reichstag brings me to my cooperation with it. Mr. Richter's ideal is, it seems to me, a bashful, cautious chancellor who throws out careful feelers whether he may offend here if he does this, or offend there. One who does not wait for a final vote of the Reichstag, but rushes home excitedly, as I have often seen my colleagues do, exclaiming, "Oh God, the law is lost! This man and that man are opposed to it." And 3 weeks later the law has passed in spite of them. I cannot enter upon such a policy of conjecture and proof by inference of what may be determined in the Reichstag, when the tendency of those who talk the loudest, but who are not always the most influential, happens to be against a bill. And if Mr. Richter should succeed in procuring such a timid chancellor, anxiously listening for every hint, my advice to you, gentlemen, is to tolerate him in this position as briefly as possible. For if a leading minister, and such he is in the empire, has no opinion of his own, and must hear from others what he should believe and do, then you do not need him at all. What Mr. Richter proposes is the government of the state by the Reichstag, the government of the state by itself, as it has been called in France, by its own chosen representatives. A chancellor, a minister, who does not dare to submit a bill, of the ultimate success of which he is not absolutely sure, is no minister. He might as well move among you with the white sign of a page, inquiring whether you will permit him to submit this or that. For such a part I am not made. To what extent I am ready to submit to the Bundesrat, I have already tried to explain, and I have closed with these words, sub judice lis est.
The case is still in court.
I need not say now whether my constitutional conviction would make me yield to the majority of the Bundesrat, if they should demand it. This question has not yet arisen. The majority has not demanded it. Whether I shall maintain my opposition, if the demand is pressed, to this question I reply, non liquet.
It is a moot point.
We shall see what happens. Such things are eventually decided by the old law which the Romans were astonished to find with the Germans, and of which they said, they call it usage. Such a usage has not yet developed in connection with the interpretation of our Constitution. Finally, Mr. Richter has found in me too much independence in a third direction. He has been pleased to believe, if I understood him correctly, that the law concerning ministerial deputies would give me the welcome opportunity of withdrawing to a more ornamental position, to use his own expression, and to leave the duties and activities to those who are deputed to represent me, establishing thus also in the imperial government the famous arcanum of decisions by majorities. But here, too, I must say that Mr. Richter will have to change the Constitution, or I shall be able to subordinate myself to the highest officials of the Empire, How can I appear before you saying, well, gentlemen, I am very doubtful whether I can advocate this measure, but the secretary in whose bureau it was worked out thinks so, and following Mr. Richter's advice, I have yielded to his authority. If you do not adopt this measure, you will gratify me, but not the secretary. This, too, would be an altogether impossible position, although Mr. Richter is expecting it of me. The chiefs of the bureaus are not responsible for me, except in so far as the law of deputies substitutes them for me, but I am responsible for their actions. I have to guarantee that they are statesmen in general accord with the policy of the empire which I am willing to advocate. If I miss this accord in one of them, not once but continually, and on principle, then it is my duty to tell him, we cannot remain in office both of us. This, too, is a task which I have never shirked when it has presented itself. It is simply my duty. I have never had need of such artful machinations and pyrotechnics as people claimed I instituted very wilfully last week. You need not think that ministers stick to their posts like many other high officials, whom not even the broadest hints can convince that their time has come. I have not yet found a minister in these days who had not to be persuaded every now and then to continue a little longer in his office, and not to be discouraged by his hard and exhausting labour, due to the simultaneous friction with three parliamentary bodies, a House of Representatives, a House of Lords, and a Reichstag, where one relieves another, or two, without waiting to be relieved, are in session at the same time. And when the fight is over, and the representatives have returned home, well satisfied, then a bureau chief comes to the minister on the day after, saying, "It is time now to get the recommendations for the next session into shape." The whole business, moreover, while very honourable, is scarcely pleasurable. Is anyone obliged to submit to such public, sharp, and impolite criticisms as a German minister? Is it true of anyone but him that the behaviour customary among people of culture does not prevail when he is addressed? Without the least scruple, one says things to him publicly which one would be ashamed to say to him privately, if one were to meet him in a drawing-room, for instance. I should not say this here if the Reichstag did not hold an exceptional position in Germany in these matters as well as in everything else. Here I have never had to hear, so far as I remember, as sharp remarks as in other assemblies. At any rate, I have a conciliatory memory, but on the whole you will agree with me that the tone of our public debates is less elevated than that of our social gatherings, especially when our ministers are addressed, but at times even among fellow members, although of this I am no competent critic. I do not even criticize the behaviour towards the ministers, for I am hardened by an experience of many years, and can stand it. I am merely describing the reasons why no minister clings to his post, and why you do me an injustice if you believe that it takes an artful effort to make a minister yield his place. Not many of them have been accustomed to see a totally ignorant correspondent tear an experienced minister to pieces in the press as if he were a stupid schoolboy. We see this in every newspaper every day, but we can stand it. We do not complain. But can anyone say that the members of the government, the bureau chiefs frequently fare even worse, meet in the parliamentary debates with that urbaneness of demeanour which characterizes our best society? I do not say no, leaving it to you to answer this question. I only say that the business of being a minister is very arduous and cheerless, subject to vexations and decidedly exhausting. This brings it about that the ministers are habitually in a mood which makes them readily give up their places as soon as they have found another excuse than the simple, "I have had enough, I do not care for more, I am tired of it." The changes of ministers, however, have not been so many nor so quick with us as they are in other countries, and this I may mention to Mr. Richter as proof of my amiability as a colleague. Count, if you will, the number of ministers who have crossed the public stage since I entered office in 1862, and sum up the resignations due to other than parliamentary reasons, and you will find a result exceedingly favourable to the accommodating spirit of the German minister when it is compared with that of any other country. I consider, therefore, the insinuating references to my quarrelsome disposition and fickleness distinctly wide of the mark. In this connection, I shall take the liberty of referring with one more word to the reproaches often occurring in the press and also in the Reichstag that I had frequently and abruptly changed my views. Well, I am not one of those who at any time in their life have believed or believe today that they can learn no more. If a man says to me, 20 years ago you held the same opinion as I still hold it, but you have changed your views, I reply, you see, I was as clever 20 years ago as you are today. Today I know more. I have learned things in these 20 years. But, gentlemen, I will not even rely on the justice of the remark. The man who does not learn also fails to progress, and cannot keep abreast of his time. People are falling behind when they remain rooted in the position they occupied years ago. However, I do not at all intend to excuse myself with such observations, for I have always had one compass only, one lode-star by which I have steered, Salus Publica, the welfare of the state. Possibly I have often acted rashly and hastily since I first began my career, but whenever I had time to think, I have always acted according to the question, what is useful, advantageous, and right for my fatherland, and, as long as this was only Prussia, for my dynasty, and today, for the German nation. I have never been a theorist. The systems which bind and separate parties are for me of secondary importance. The nation comes first. Its position in the world and its independence, and above all, our organization along lines which will make it possible for us to draw the free breath of a great nation. Everything else, a liberal, reactionary, or conservative constitution, gentlemen, I freely confess, all this I consider in second place. It is the luxury of furnishing the house when the house is firmly established. In the interest of the country, I can parley now with one person, now with another in purely party questions. Theories I barter away cheaply. First, let us build a structure, secure on the outside, and firmly knit on the inside, and protected by the ties of a national union. After that, when you ask my advice about furnishing the house with more or less liberal constitutional fittings, you may perhaps hear me say, Ah, well, I have no preconceived ideas. Make your suggestions, and, when the sovereign whom I serve agrees, you will find no objections on principle on my part. It can be done thus, and again thus. There are many roads leading to Rome. There are times when one should govern liberally, and times when one should govern autocratically. Everything changes. Nothing is eternal in these matters. But the structure of the German Empire and the union of the German nation, I demand that they be free and unassailable, with not only a passing field fortification on one side. I have given to its creation and growth my entire strength from the very beginning, and if you point to a single moment when I have not steered by this direction of the compass needle, you may perhaps prove that I have erred, but you cannot prove that I have for one moment lost sight of the national goal.
End of section 1. Read by Alister, Melbourne, 13th of July 2023. Section 2 of Speeches of Prince Bismarck, Part 2, by Otto von Bismarck, translated by Edmund von Mach. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. First half of Practical Christianity, April 2nd, 1881. Translated by Edmund von Mach, Ph.D. Prince Bismarck was trying to fight the revolutionary parties, not only with such restrictive laws as had been passed against the socialists, but also with constructive measures like the one which had been submitted to the Reichstag on March 8, 1881. It proposed the insurance of the working man against accidents and the founding of a governmental insurance company. The bill was severely criticised, notably by Eugene Richter, who did not miss the opportunity of attacking also the Chancellor personally. Prince Bismarck's reply made a deep impression in the country at large. The bill itself, however, was so badly amended in the Reichstag that Bismarck urged the Bundesrat to reject it, which it did. Several changes thereupon were made in the bill, and, after having been delayed in committee, it was again brought up for discussion in 1884, when another exhaustive speech by the Chancellor on March 15th brought about its acceptance. Before turning to the subject in hand, I wish to reply to some remarks of the previous speaker, lest I forget them. They are of so little weight. He finished by saying that my prestige was waning. If he were right, I should feel like saying, "Thank God," for prestige is a very burdensome affair. One suffers under its weight, and quickly gets tired of it. I do not care a farthing for it. When I was very much younger, about as old as the previous speaker is now, and when I was possibly still more ambitious than he, I lived for years without prestige, and was actually disliked, if not hated, by the majority of my fellow citizens. At that time I felt better and more contented, and was healthier than during the years when I was most popular. Such things do not mean much to me. I am doing my duty, let come what may. As proof of his assertion, the previous speaker claimed that the working men are refusing the help which the imperial government is trying to offer them. This he cannot possibly know. He has no idea what the great mass of the working men are thinking. Probably he has some accurate information of what the eloquent place hunters are thinking of the bill, people who are at the head of the labour movements, and the professional publicists who need a following of working men, dissatisfied working men. But as to the working man in general, we had better wait and see what he is thinking. I do not know whether the full meaning of this question has even yet sufficiently penetrated into his circles to make it a subject of discussion, except in the learned clubs of labourers and among the leading place hunters and speakers. In the next election, we shall be able to tell whether the working men have formed their opinion of the bill by then, not to speak of now. The legislation on which we are entering with this bill has to do with a question which will probably stay on your calendar for a long while. The previous speaker has correctly said that it opens up a very deep perspective, and it is not all that impossible that it may also make the modern socialists judge more kindly of the government. We have been talking of a social question for 50 years, and since the passage of the law against the socialists, I have been constantly reminded, officially, from high quarters, and by the people, that we gave a promise at that time. Something positive should be done to remove the causes for socialism, in so far as they are legitimate. I have received such reminders daily, nor do I believe that this social question, which has been before us for 50 years now, will be definitely settled even by our children and our children's children. No political question ever reaches so complete a mathematical solution that the books can be balanced. Such questions arise, abide a while, and finally give way to other historical problems. This is the way of organic developments. I deem it my duty to take up this question quietly and without party vehemence, because I do not know who else could do this successfully, if not the imperial government. It is a pity that party questions should be mixed up in it. The previous speaker has referred to a supposedly active exchange of telegrams between certain parties and an high official, which in this case I must believe means me. I am mentioning this in passing because he said the same thing a few days ago in another speech. Gentlemen, this is a very simple matter. I receive thousands of telegrams, and, being a polite man, I should probably reply also to a telegram from Mr. Richter if he were to honour me with a friendly dispatch. When I am cordially addressed in a message, I have to reply in cordial terms. I cannot possibly have the police ascertain to what party the senders belong. Nor am I so diffident in my views that I should wish to catechize the senders as to their political affiliations. If anybody takes pleasure in making me appear to be a member of anti-Semitic societies, let him do so. I have kept away from all undesirable movements as my position demands, and I could wish that also you gentlemen would refrain more than heretofore from inciting the classes against each other, and from oratorical phrases which fan class hatred. This refers especially to those gentlemen who have bestowed their kind attention upon the government and upon me personally. When we heard the representative, Mr. Lasker, say the other day that the policy of the government was aristocratic, this term was bound to render the whole aristocracy, and what belongs to it, suspected of selfishness in the eyes of the poor men at whose expense the aristocracy seemingly exists. When such expressions fall on anti-Semitic ground, how is it possible to avoid reprisals? The anti-Semites will coin their own word, with which to designate, as they think appropriately, the policies opposed to ours. The resulting epithet I do not care to mention. Everyone will think of it himself. When afterwards a newspaper like the Tribune, which is said to be owned by Mr. Bamberger, makes itself the mouthpiece of Mr. Lasker's expression, claiming it to be correct, and hailing the invention of this word as a discovery worthy of Columbus, and when the Tribune finally asserts that the care for the poor and aristocracy cannot exist in the same train of thought, can you not imagine what will happen when all this is turned around and altered by an anti-Semite? Are you in doubt what he will substitute for aristocracy? And do you not know that he will repeat every twist and turn of speech with which Mr. Bamberger's sheet imputes selfish injustice to the aristocracy? The representative, Mr. Richter, has called attention to the responsibility of the state for everything it does in the field on which it is entering today. Well, gentlemen, I feel that the state may become responsible also for the things that it does not do. I do not believe that the laissez-faire, laissez-aller theory and the unadulterated political theories of Manchester, such as let each one do what he chooses and fare as he will, or who is not strong enough to stand, let him be crushed, or he who has will receive more, and he who has not, from him let us take, can be practised in any state, least of all in a monarchical state, governed by the father of his country. On the contrary, I believe that those who shudder at the state exerting its influence for the protection of the weaker brethren themselves intend to capitalize their strength, be it financial, rhetorical, or what not, that they may gain a following, or oppress the rest, or smooth their own way to party control. They become angry, of course, as soon as their plans are spoiled by the rising influence of the state. The representative, Mr. Richter, says this legislation does not go far enough. If he will have patience, we may perhaps be able to satisfy him a little later. One should not be hasty, or try to do everything at once. Such laws are not made arbitrarily out of theories, and as a result of asking, what kind of law would it be wise to make now? They are gradual outgrowth of earlier events. The reason why we come to you today, only with an accident insurance law, is because this branch of the care of the poor and the weak was especially vigorous even before I seriously concerned myself with such matters. Requests, suggestions, and notes for such a bill were on file when I assumed office. According to the records, this bill was needed more than any other. When I began to study it, I must confess that it did not seem to me to go far enough in the theory, and I was tempted to change the words which occur. I believe in the first paragraph, every working man who, and shall be reimbursed in such and such a way, to read every German. There is something ideal in this change. If one thinks of it more seriously, however, and especially if one plans to include also the independent workmen, who meet with an accident at no one's behest but their own, the question of insurance is even more difficult. No 2 hours' speech of any representative can give us so much concern as this problem has given us. How far is it possible to extend this law without creating at the very start an unfavourable condition, or reaching out too far, and thus overreaching ourselves. As a farmer, I was tempted to ask whether it would be possible to extend the insurance, for instance, also to farmhands, who constitute the majority of the working men in our eastern provinces. I shall not give up hope that this may be possible, but there are difficulties which for the time being have prevented us from doing this, and concerning these I wish to say a few words. The farming industry, in so far as it has to do with machinery and elemental forces, is, of course, not excluded from the law. But the remaining great majority of the country population also comes in frequent contact with machines, although these are set in motion not by elemental forces, but by horses or fellow labourers. Such occupations are often dangerous and unwholesome, but it is exceedingly difficult to gather statistics and percentages, and to define the necessary amount of contributions to an insurance fund. The representative Mr. Richter knows, apparently from experience, the proper percentage in every branch of human occupation, for he has quoted his figures with much assurance. I should be grateful to him if he would mention also the source of his valuable information. We have done the best we could. The preliminary drafts of the bill were based on carefully selected facts. Notice, please, selected facts and not arbitrary statistics based on conjecture. If we had discovered those figures, which the quicker eye of the Honourable Mr. Richter seems to have detected at a glance, and if we had believed them to be accurate, we should have gone further in this bill. When I say that I do not give up hope that the farming industry may yet be included, I am thinking of an organization which cannot be created at one session of the Reichstag, like the child which must be small if it is to be born at all, and which gradually assumes its proper proportions by growth. So also this organization will have to develop gradually. Eventually, the various branches of industry which have insured their labourers should be formed into incorporated associations, and each association should raise among its members the premiums needed for the proper insurance of its labourers. It should, at the same time, exercise supervision over its members, to the extent that the dues should be as low as possible. Or, to put it differently, the personal interest of the contributing members should see to it that adequate means for the prevention of accident are adopted. If this can be accomplished by a gradual advance based on experience, we may also hope to find, by experience, the proper percentage as regards that branch of farming which does not employ elemental forces. Our lack of experience in these matters has also induced us to be very careful about the assessment of the necessary contributions. I certainly should not have the courage to press this bill if the expenses which it entails were to be borne exclusively by the various industries. If the assistance which the state would render, either by provincial or country associations, or directly, were to be entirely omitted, I should not dare to answer to our industries for the consequences of this law. Perhaps this can be done, and after a few years of experience, we may be able to judge whether it is possible. The state contribution, therefore, may be limited at first to 3 years, or to whatever period you wish, but without any actual experience, without any practical test of what we are to expect, I do not dare to burden our industries with all the expenses of this government institution, and to add to their taxes. I do not dare to place upon them the whole burden of caring for the injured factory or mill hands. The country associations used to do this, and in the future it will be done more fully and in a more dignified way by the insurers and by the state. No entirely new changes are here contemplated. The changes are merely transferred from the country associations to the state. I do not deny that the tax of him who pays, and the advantages which accrue to the labourer, will be increased. The increase, however, does not equal the full third which the state is to bear, but only the difference between what at present the country associations are obliged to do for the injured workman, and what these men will receive in future. You see, it is purely a question of improving the lot of the labouring man. This difference, therefore, is the only new charge on the state with which you have to reckon, and you will have to ask yourselves, is the advantage gained worth this difference, when we aim to procure for the labourer who has been injured a better and more adequate support, and relieve him of the necessity of having to fight for his right in court, and when he will receive without delay the moderate stipend which the state decrees? I feel like answering the question with a strong affirmative. Our present poor laws keep the injured labouring man from starvation. According to the law, at least, nobody need starve. Whether in reality this never happens, I do not know. But this is not enough in order to let the men look contentedly into the future and to their own old age. The present bill intends to keep the sense of human dignity alive, which even the poorest German should enjoy, if I have my way. He should feel that he is no mere eleemosynary, but that he possesses a fund which is his very own. No one shall have the right to dispose of it, or to take it from him, however poor he may be. This fund will open for him many a door which otherwise will remain closed to him, and it will secure for him better treatment in the house where he has been received, because when he leaves he can take away with him whatever contributions he has been making to the household expenses. If you have ever personally investigated the conditions of the poor in our large cities, or of the village paupers in the country, you have been able to observe the wretched treatment which the poor occasionally receive, even in the best managed communities, especially if they are physically weak or crippled. This happens in the houses of their stepmothers, or relatives of any kind, yes, also in those of their nearest of kin. Knowing this, are you not obliged to confess that every healthy labouring man who sees such things must say to himself, is it not terrible that a man is thus degraded in the house which he used to inhabit as master, and that his neighbour's dog is not worse off than he? Such things do happen. What protection is there for a poor cripple who is pushed into a corner, and is not given enough to eat? There is none. But if he has as little as 100 or 200 marks of his own, the people will think twice before they oppress him. We have been in a position to observe this in the case of the military invalids. Although only $5 or $6 are paid every month, this actual cash amounts to something in the household, where the poor are boarded, and the thrifty housewife is careful not to offend or to lose the boarder who pays cash. I therefore assure you that we felt the need of insisting by this law on the treatment of the poor which should be worthy of humanity. Next year I shall be able fully to satisfy Mr. Richter in regard to the amount and the extent of the attention which the state will give to a better and more adequate care for all the unemployed. This will come as a natural consequence, whether or no the present bill is passed. Today this bill is a test, as it were. We are sounding to see how deep the waters are, financially, into which we are asking the state and the country to enter. You cannot guard yourself against such problems by delivering elegant and sonorous speeches in which you recommend the improvement of our laws of liability, without in the least indicating how this can be done. In this way you cannot settle these questions, for you are acting like the ostrich, who hides his head lest he see his danger. The government has seen its duty, and is facing, calmly and without fear, the dangers we heard described here not a few days ago most eloquently, and of which we were given convincing proofs. We should, however, also remove as much as possible the causes which are used to excite the people, and which alone can render them susceptible to criminal doctrines. It would then almost seem that with this bill only a very small distance separated us from the murderous band of the Hasselmann, the incendiary writings of the Most, and the revolutionary conspiracies of the Congress of Wien, and that even this distance would soon disappear. Well, gentlemen, this is, of course, the very opposite of true. Those who fight with such oratorical and meaningless niceties are counting on the many meanings of the word socialism. As a result of the kind of programs which the socialists have issued, this term is, in our public opinion today, almost synonymous with criminal. If the government endeavours to treat the injured working men better in future, and especially more becomingly, and not only to offer to their as yet vigorous brethren the spectacle, as it were, of an old man on the dump-heap slowly starving to death, this cannot be called socialistic, in the sense in which that murderous band was painted to us the other day. People are playing a cheap game with the shadow on the wall, when they call our endeavours socialistic. If the representative Mr. Bamberger, who took no offence at the word Christian, wishes to give a name to our endeavours, which I could cheerfully accept, let it be practical Christianity, but sans phrase, for we shall not pay the people with words and speeches, but with actual improvements. Yet death alone is had for the asking. If you refuse to reach into your pocket-book, or that of the state, you will not accomplish anything. If you should place the whole burden on the industries, I do not know whether they could bear it. Some might be able to do it, but not all. Those who could do it are the industries where the wages are but a small fraction of the total cost of production. Among such I mention the chemical factories, and the mills with which 20 mill hands can do an annual business of several million marks. The great mass of labourers, however, does not work in such establishments, which I am tempted to call aristocratic, without wishing to excite any class hatred. They are in industries where the wages amount to 80 or 90% of the cost of production. Whether the latter can bear the additional burden, I do not know. It is, moreover, perfectly immaterial whether the assessment is made on the employer or on the employee. In either case, the industry will have to bear it, for the contribution of the labourer will eventually, and of necessity, be added to the expenses of the industry. There is a general complaint that the average wages of the labourers make the saving of a surplus impossible. If you wish, therefore, to add a burden to the labourers whose present wages are no more than sufficient, the employers will have to increase the wages, or the labourers will leave them for other occupations. End of section 2. Read by Alister, Geraldton, 22nd of September, 2023. Section 3 of Speeches of Prince Bismarck, Part 2, by Otto von Bismarck, translated by Edmund von Mach. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Second half of Practical Christianity, April 2nd, 1881. Translated by Edmund von Mach, Ph.D. The previous speaker called the bill defective because the principle of relieving the labour from all contributions had not been consistently followed, and he spoke as if this principle had not been at all followed. Labourers receiving more than 750 marks in 300 working days are, it is true, not affected by it, and this is due to the origin of the bill. The first draft read that 1/3 of contributions should be made by those county associations which would have to support the injured men in conformity with the poor laws of the state. We did not wish to merely make a gift to these associations, which at present are responsible for 80% of all injured working men, that is, for those who do not come under the law of liability. We therefore accepted as just the proposition that these associations should pay 1/3 toward the insurance of those men who formerly would have become their charges. Labourers, however, whose pay is large enough to keep them from becoming public charges when they meet with an accident, hold an exceptional position. I am none the less perfectly willing to drop this exception in the bill, as I have said repeatedly. But since the Reichstag in its entirety has thus far placed itself on record as opposed to any contribution from the state, I should not gain thereby any votes for the bill. I wish to declare, however, that this limit of 750 marks is of no consequence compared with the theory on which the bill is based. It arose from a sense of justice toward the county associations, which were not to be burdened with higher taxes than would equal their savings under this bill. Later it was discovered from many actual examples that the insurance according to the existing county associations was impossible, because the state, which really is responsible for the care of the poor, had distributed it in an arbitrary and unjust way on the various county associations. Small and weak country communities are often overburdened with the care of poor people, while large and wealthy communities may have practically no charges, since the geographical position alone has determined the membership in the various county associations. The result, therefore, of levying the necessary contributions on these associations would have been a very uneven distribution of the assessments. Being convinced of this, I suggested the substitution of provincial association for county association, and thus the bill read for several weeks, until we yielded to the wishes of the Allied States and of the Economic Council, and left to each state the question whether it wished to take the place of these various associations, or preferred to call upon them in any way it chose. These are the steps by which we reached the 750 mark exemption, and unconditional share which is to be paid by the state. This share is nothing but a hint to the legislature how to distribute the care of the poor to the various county and other associations. Whatever is done, you will agree with me that we need a revision of our poor laws. Just how this will eventually be accomplished is immaterial to me. I am not astonished that the most divergent views are held on this new subject, which touches our lives very intimately, and which no experience has yet illuminated. Because of this divergence of opinion, I am also aware that we may be unable to pass an acceptable law at this session. My own interest in this entire work would be very much lessened if I were to notice that the principle of a state contribution were to be definitely rejected, and that the legislative assembly of the country were to vote against state contributions. This would transfer the whole matter to the sphere of open commerce, if I may say so, and in that case it might be better to leave the insurance to private enterprise, rather than to establish a state institution without any compulsion. I should certainly not have the courage to exercise compulsion if the state did not at the same time make contribution. If compulsion is exercised, it is necessary for the law to establish a department of insurance. This is cheaper and safer than any company. You cannot expose the savings of the poor to possible insolvency, nor can you allow any part of the contributions to be used for the payment of dividends or interest on stocks and bonds. The representative, Mr. Bamberger, based his opposition to the bill, you remember his strong words, largely on his sorrow at the impending ruin of the insurance companies. He said they would be crushed and annihilated, and he added that they were soliciting the gratitude of their fellow citizens. I always thought they were soliciting the money of their fellow citizens. If in addition they can get their gratitude, they are turning a very clever trick. That they should be willing, like good souls, to sacrifice themselves in the interest of the working men, and establish their institutions of insurance without issuing any shares, I have never believed, and it would be difficult to convince me of it. According to my feeling of right and wrong, we cannot force anybody to join private insurance companies, which may become bankrupt even under good management, owing to fluctuations in the market, or to panics, and which have to arrange their premiums so that dividends are realized for those who are investing their capital, or at least interest on the invested money and the hope of dividends. To this I cannot lend my assistance. If the state is going to exercise compulsion, it must, I believe, undertake the insurance itself. It may be the empire for all, or the individual state, but without this, no compulsion. Nor have I the courage, as I have already said, to exercise any compulsion if I cannot offer something in return. This contribution of a third is, as I said before, much smaller than it looks, because the associations will be greatly relieved of the old burdens which the state had imposed on them. If this is communism, as the last speaker called it, and not socialism, I do not care one iota. I shall call it again and again practical Christianity legally demonstrated. If, however, it is communism, then communism has been extensively practiced in the districts for a long while, and actually under state compulsion. The previous speaker said that by our method, the lower classes would be oppressed with indirect taxes in order to collect the funds for the care of the poor. But I ask you, gentlemen, what is being done in the large cities, in Berlin, for instance, which the speaker thinks is splendidly governed by the liberal ring? Here the poor man is taken care of with the proceeds of the tax on rents, which is exacted of his slightly less poor brother, and tomorrow he may have this brother as a companion in misery, when a warrant is executed against the latter for the non-payment of this tax. That is the more cruel than if the payment were made from the tax on tobacco or alcohol. The previous speaker said that I had spoken against the tax on alcohol. I really do not remember this, and I should be grateful if he would prove this by quoting one word. I have always mentioned tobacco and alcohol as commodities on which larger taxes should be levied, but I have expressed a doubt whether it is right to tax the alcohol in factories while it is being made. Many states, as for instance France, do not levy any tax on alcohol, or assess it at a different time. The representative, therefore, has made a mistake, no doubt unintentionally. When, however, this mistake will be printed, without refutation, in many papers which are under his influence, it will, I am sure, make no mean impression. I will not dilate on the defects of the law of liability, which will be discussed by experienced men who have had more to do with it than I. These defects, however, added their weight to the promise we made when the law against the Socialists was promulgated. You undoubtedly remember it, and I have been reminded of it often enough, and were my chief reasons for submitting to you the present bill. Our present law of liability has shown surprisingly bad results. I have convinced myself, by actual occurrences, that the suits arising under this law often terminate unexpectedly and unfairly, if they are successful. And, if they are unsuccessful, they are frequently equally unfair. I have been assured by many creditable people that this law does not improve the relations between the employer and the employees. On the contrary, the bitter feelings between them is increased, wherever there are many such suits, especially where there are shyster lawyers who like to sow discord with an eye to the elections. This is in strong contrast to the good intentions of the law. The working men, however, consider themselves injured by it, because not even a decree of the court will convince them that they are wrong, especially if they have lawyers who tell them they are right, and that they should appeal their case to 4 or 5 higher courts, if there were as many. These observations made me wish to introduce a system which would work smoothly, and in which there would be no question of suits at law, or investigations into anyone's culpability. The latter is quite immaterial for him who has been injured. He remains unfortunate, crippled, and unable to earn a living. If this has been his lot, or if he has been killed, his family is left without its breadwinner. Whether the accident was due to criminal neglect, carelessness, or unavoidable circumstances. These are not questions of corrective or distributive justice, but of protection. Without a proper law, a great part of our population is helpless before the hardships of life or the consequences of an accident. Without any capital of their own, these people have no redress against the cruelties which are the lot of the pauper who has become a public charge. I will not reply at length to the reproach that this is communism, but I would like to ask you not to discuss everything from the point of view of party strategy or faction strategy, or from the feeling, away with Bismarck. We have to do here with matters where not one of us can see his way clearly, and where we must search for the right road with sticks and sounding rods. I should like to see another man in my place as speedily as possible. If he would continue my work, I should gladly say to him, "Son, take up your father's spear," even if he were not my own son. This undesirable way of discussing matters showed itself the other day, when the gentlemen fought for the poor man, as if they had to do with the body of Patroclus. Mr. Lasker took hold of him at one end, and I tried to snatch him away from Mr. Lasker as best I could. But where do imputed motives and class hatred and the excitement of misery and suffering lead us? Such behaviour comes too near being socialism in the sense in which Mr. Puttkamer exposed it the other day. Alms constitute the first step of Christian charity, such as must exist in France, for instance, to a great extent. There are no poor laws in France, and every poor man has a right to starve to death if charitable people do not prevent him from doing so. Charity is the first duty, and the second is the assistance given by districts and according to the law. A state, however, which is composed very largely of Christians, even if you are horrified at hearing it called a Christian state, should let itself be permeated with the principles which it confesses, and especially with those which have to do with the help of our neighbours, and the sympathy one feels for the lot which threatens the old and the sick. The extensive discussions which I have partly heard and partly read in the parliamentary extracts of yesterday compel me to make some further observations. The representative, Mr. Richter, has said that the whole bill amounted to a subsidy of the big industries. Well, here again you would have an instance of class hatred, which would receive new fuel if his words were true. I do not know why you assume that the government cherishes a blind and special love for the big industries. The big manufacturers are, it is true, children of fortune, and this creates no goodwill toward them among the rest of the people. But to weaken or to confine their existence would be a very foolish experiment. If we dropped our big industries, making it impossible for them to compete with those of other countries, and if we placed burdens on them which they have not yet been proved able to bear, we might meet with the approval of all who are vexed at seeing anybody richer than other people, most especially than themselves. But if we ruin the big industries, what shall we do with the labourers? In such a case we should be facing the problem to which the representative Mr. Richter referred with much concern, of the organisation of labour. If a business employing 20,000 labourers and more goes to pieces, and if the big industries go to pieces because they have been denounced to public opinion and to the legislature as dangerous and liable to heavier taxes, we could not let 20,000 and hundreds of thousands of labourers starve to death. In such a case, we should have to organise a genuine state socialism and find work for these labourers, similar to what we have been doing every panic. If the objections of the representative Mr. Richter, who claimed that we must guard ourselves against state socialism as against some disease, were well taken, how does it happen that we are providing work whenever a calamity has afflicted one or another of the provinces? Such work would not be provided if the working men could find other remunerative occupations. In such cases we build railways of doubtful productivity and make improvements which, under ordinary circumstances, are left to the individual citizens to make. If this is communism, I am by no means opposed to it, but the use of such catchwords does not advance the solution of any problem. I have already commented on Mr. Bamberger's defence of the private insurance companies. I am, however, convinced that we are not called upon to espouse their cause of all others when we are confronted by tremendous economic needs. He has also referred to the 4 weeks which have to elapse before the insurance takes effect. This was done in the hope that the unions and societies would wish to do something themselves. We are always told that the labourers deem insurance to be contrary to their honour, unless they contribute something toward it. For this reason, we have left the first 4 weeks uninsured. I am not certain on this point, but if another solution seems better, I believe that the law should cover also this hiatus. There is no fundamental objection to this. One single fact will throw much light on the considerable burdens of which the county communities will be relieved when the care of their poor will pass, according to this bill, to the community of the state. I have been unable to ascertain the number of persons to whom assistance is given in the Empire or in the Kingdom of Prussia, and even less to discover the amount of money spent for this purpose. In the country and elsewhere, private charity and public help are so intermingled that it is impossible to separate them or to keep accurate accounts. The 170 cities, however, which have more than 10,000 inhabitants, expend on the average 4 marks per capita for the care of their poor. This item varies between 0.63 mark and 12.84 marks, a great variation, you see. The most remarkable results are found where the majority of the labourers are banded together in unions or similar associations. It would be natural to think that places like Oberneukirchen and Duttweiler, with large factory populations, would have a very large budget for the poor, and that Berlin, which is only in part an industrial centre, would be an average locality for our purposes, if its finances were well managed. As a matter of fact, it pays far more than the average for the care of its poor, without doing this exceptionally well. Anyone who is interested in private charities and cares to visit the poor of Berlin will be convinced of their pitiful condition. Nevertheless, the Berlin budget for the poor amounts to 5 million marks. These are the latest figures, and for the care of the sick poor, to 1,900,000 marks. Why these two items should be separated, I do not know. Together, therefore, they amount to about 7 million marks, or 7 marks per capita, while the average of the large cities is 4 marks. If such a poor tax of 7 marks per capita were extended to the whole empire, it would yield 300 million marks, and if the direct taxes of Berlin, amounting to 23 marks per capita, were levied on the empire, we should receive more than 1 million marks in direct taxes, including those on rents and incomes. Fortunately, not all the people of the empire are living under a liberal ring, and least of all the inhabitants of the cities where the majority of working men have joined unions or similar associations. We have discovered the remarkable fact that Oberneukirchen, with its large factory population, pays only 0.58 mark, and Duttweiler 0.72 mark per capita for the care of their poor. These are instances which throw light on the relief of the communities if a system similar to that of the unions would be introduced. I do not at all intend to make so expensive a proposition to you, and I have already said that we shall have to work on this legislation for at least a generation. But look at the glaring examples of Duttweiler and Oberneukirchen. Without their unions, their budget for the poor would perhaps not rise to the Berlin figure, but they would easily amount to 5 marks per capita. Actually, however, they are less than 1 mark, and almost as low as half a mark. What a tremendous burden will be taken from the charity departments of a city of 10,000 inhabitants by a law like the one under discussion! Why, then, should they not be asked to make some kind of contribution to the insurance fund? But the contributions should not be made by the districts, but by larger units. And, since the state is the largest, I insist that the contributions should be made by the state. If you do not yield in this point to the Allied governments, I shall look placidly, and without being offended, toward further discussions and another session of the Reichstag. This I consider to be an all-important part of the law, and without it the bill would no longer appear to me to be as valuable as I have thought it was, and it would seem to lack the chief characteristic which induced me to become its sponsor. The previous speaker and the Honourable Mr. Bamberger have looked askance at the Economic Council. This, gentleman, was perfectly natural, for competition in eloquence is as much disliked as in business. And there are in this council not only men of exceptionally great practical knowledge, but also some very good speakers. When the council has been more firmly established, these men will perhaps deliver as long and expert speeches as those representatives are doing who pass themselves off as the expert spokesmen of labour. I really do not consider it to be polite or politically advantageous to refer to the councillors who have come here, at the call of their king, to voice their honest opinions with as much contempt as the representatives whom I have mentioned have done. Most woods return the echo of what we call into them, and why should the representative Mr. Richter unnecessarily make for himself even more enemies than he has? He is like me in that the number of his opponents is growing, and is no longer small. His ear, however, is not so keen as mine to detect the existence of an opponent, and I am satisfied to wait and see which one of us in the long run will appear to have been right. Possibly this may not be decided in our lifetime. That also will be agreeable to me. The representative, Mr. Bamberger, has expressed his astonishment in discussing matters with the council that the delegates of the sea-coast cities have been granted the right to decide about questions relating to gunpowder and playing cards. Well, gentlemen, the delegates from the inland districts are far more numerous than those from the sea-coast, and we have not made this division arbitrarily. Since we look upon the free trade theory as an epidemic which is afflicting us like the Colorado beetle or similar evils, you cannot possibly expect that we should ask the free traders to represent the whole country in matters where we happen to have the choice. Generally speaking, the free traders represent the interests of maritime commerce, of merchants, and of a very few other people. Opposed to them is the much greater weight of all the inland districts. The more, therefore, the Economic Council will be perfected, the more the propriety and reasonableness of the present arrangement will be appreciated. The Council has, to my great delight, excellent chances of extending its usefulness over the whole empire. These remarks will scarcely win me, I believe, the good graces of Messrs. Richter and Bamberger. If they did, it would be for me an argumentum e contrario. I am always of the opinion that the very opposite of their views is serviceable for the state, and the interests of the fatherland, as I understand them. I have already replied to the reproach of home socialism. One of the previous speakers, however, goes so far as to identify me with foreigners, because I am glad to assume the responsibility for this law and its intellectual origin. These foreigners are, no doubt, excellent men, but they have nothing to do with our affairs. They are men like Nadeau, Clemenceau, Spuller, Lockroy, and others. I believe this was intended to be a complicated reproach of both socialism and communism. You see, it is always the same tune. Then he mentioned the intrepidity, which I translate for myself to mean the frivolous levity of the government in suggesting such matters. The considerate politeness of the speaker induced him to call it intrepidity. Gentlemen, our intrepidity springs from our good conscience. We are convinced that what we are proposing is the result of dutiful and careful consideration, and is not in the least tinged with party politics. In this we are superior to our opponents, who will never be able to free themselves from the soil of party warfare which clings to their boots. The previous speaker compared us also with the Romans. You see, he made his historical excursions not only into France, but also into the past. The difference between Mr. Bamberger's and our point of view which Mr. Lasker may call aristocratic if he chooses, appears in his very choice of words. Mr. Bamberger spoke of theatres which we were erecting for the sweet rabble. Whether there is anything sweet in the rabble for Mr. Bamberger, I do not know. But we are filled with satisfaction at the thought that we may be able to do something in the legislature for the less fortunate classes, whom he designates as rabble, and to wrest them, if you will grant the money, from the evil influences of place-hunters whose eloquence is too much for their intelligence. The expression rabble did not fall from our lips, and if the representative spoke of the rabble first, and afterwards of those who cut off coupons, I deny having used also this word. To cut off coupons is linguistically not familiar to me. I believe I said, those who cut coupons. The meaning, of course, remains the same, but let me remark that I consider this class of people to be highly estimable, and from a minister's point of view, exceedingly desirable, because they combine wealth with that degree of diffidence which keeps them from all tainted or dangerous enterprises. A man who pays a large tax and loves peace is, from the ministerial point of view, the most agreeable of citizens. He must, of course, not try to escape the burdens which his easily collected income should bear in comparison with others, and you will see that he really does not do it. He is an honest man, and when we shall at last have outgrown the finance ministerial mistrust of olden times, which my present colleagues no longer share, we shall see that not everybody is willing to lie for his own financial benefit, and that even the man who cuts coupons will declare his wealth honestly and pay his taxes accordingly. The Honourable Mr. Bamberger also asked, where will you find the necessary money? This law really implies few new expenses, as I have already said, because all the government asks is to be permitted to substitute the state for the communities which at present are taking care of the poor, and to make a very modest allowance to those who cannot earn their living. This allowance should be entirely at the disposal of the recipient, and be inalienable from him. It will thus secure for him independence even when he is invalid. The increase over the present cost of caring for the poor is slight. I do not know whether it should be estimated at half of 1/3, 1/6, or even less. I am, therefore, of the opinion that a state which is at war with the infernal elements recently described to you here in detail, and which possesses among its citizens an overwhelming majority of sincere adherents of the Christian religion, should do for the poor, the weak, and the old, much more than this bill demands. As much as I hope to be able to ask of you next year. And such a state, especially when it wishes to demonstrate its practical Christianity, should not refuse our demands, for its own sake, and for the sake of the poor. End of section 3. Read by Alister, Geraldton, 22nd of September, 2023. Section 4 of Speeches of Prince Bismarck, Part 2, by Otto von Bismarck, translated by Edmund von Mach. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. First half of We Germans Fear God and Nought Else in the World, February 6, 1888. Translated by Edmund von Mach, Ph.D. In view of the constantly increasing armaments in France, the government had secured from the Reichstag of 1887 an increase also of the German army. Danger, however, was threatening from Russia as well as from France, and it became necessary to arrange matters in a way which would place the full strength of the German people at the disposal of the government. A bill to this effect was introduced in the Reichstag on December 9th, 1887, and another bill, which was to procure the money for this increase in armaments, was introduced on January 31st, 1888. Both bills were on the calendar of February 6th. Prince Bismarck opened the discussion with the following speech, the effect of which was electric, and resulted in the Reichstag passing both bills by a unanimous vote. In addressing you today, I do not intend to recommend to you the acceptance of the bill which your President has just mentioned. I have no fear concerning its acceptance, nor do I believe that I can do anything to increase the majority with which it will be passed, although this is, of course, of great importance both at home and abroad. The representatives of the various parties have, no doubt, decided how they will vote, and I am confident that the German Reichstag will grant us again an increase in our armed force, and thus re-establish the standard which we gradually gave up between 1867 and 1882, and will do so not on account of the position in which we happen to find ourselves, nor of any fears which may be swaying the stock exchange and public opinion, but because of an anticipatory estimate of the general conditions of Europe. In addressing you, therefore, I shall have more to say about these conditions than about the bill. I do not like to do this, for in these matters one unskilful word can do great harm, and many words can do small good beyond making people understand the situation at home and abroad, which they will do in due time anyhow. I do not like to speak, but if I should keep silence, the nervous excitement of public opinion at home and abroad will be increased rather than decreased, I fear, in view of expectations which have been based on today's debate. People would believe the situation so difficult and critical that a Minister of Foreign Affairs did not even dare to touch upon it. For these reasons I am addressing you, but I must say that I am doing it reluctantly. I might be satisfied with a reference to what I have said here just about a year ago, for matters are but slightly changed. A newspaper clipping has been handed to me, containing a summary in the Liberal News, an organ which has closer relations, I believe, with my political friend, the Honourable Mr. Richter, than with myself. This clipping might offer me a starting point from which to develop the situation as a whole, but I can refer to it, and the chief points made there, only with the general declaration that the situation has been improved rather otherwise, if it has been changed at all. A year ago, we were largely concerned with the possible cause of war emanating from France. Since then, a peace-loving president has dropped the reins of government, and another peace-loving president has succeeded him. It is a favourable sign that the French government did not dip into Pandora's box in calling to office another chief magistrate, and that we may be assured of the continuance, under President Carnot, of the peaceful policy which President Gravy was known to respect. Changes in the French cabinet are even more reassuring than the change in the presidency, where a great many different reasons had to be considered. The ministers who might have been ready to subordinate the peace of their own country and of Europe to their personal plans have resigned, and others have taken their places, of whom we need not fear this. I believe, therefore, that I may state that our outlook towards France is more peaceful and less explosive today than it was a year ago, and I am glad to do this, because I wish to quiet, not to excite public opinion. The fears which have sprung up during the last 12 months have had more to do with Russia than with France, or I may say, with the exchange of mutual excitement, threats, insults, and challenges in the French and Russian papers during the past summer. Nevertheless, I believe that our relations with Russia have not changed from what they were last year. The liberal news has stated, in especially heavy type, that I said a year ago, "Our friendship with Russia has suffered no interruption during our wars, and is today beyond a doubt. We expect of Russia neither an attack nor a hostile policy." The reason why this was printed in heavy type may have been either to give me an easy starting point, or because the writer hoped that I had changed my mind since I said these things, and was at present convinced that I had erred in my confidence in the Russian policy a year ago. This is not the case. The only events which could have occasioned a change of opinion are the attitude of the Russian press and the allocation of the Russian troops. As regards the press, I cannot assign any importance to it per se. People say that it is of greater consequence in Russia than in France. I believe the very opposite to be true. In France, the press is a power influencing the decisions of the government. In Russia, it is not, nor can it be. In both cases, however, the press is, so far as I am concerned, mere printer's ink on paper, against which we do not wage war. It cannot contain a challenge for us. Back of each article in the press there stands, after all, only the single man who guided the pen which launched this particular article into the world. Even in a Russian sheet, suppose it to be an independent Russian sheet, one which maintains relations with the French secret funds, it is of no consequence. The pen which there indites an anti-German article is backed by no one but him who is guiding it, the solitary man who is concocting the sad stuff in his office, and the protector which every Russian sheet is accustomed to have. He is some kind of higher official, run wild in party politics, who happens to bestow his protection on this particular paper. Both weigh like feathers in the scale against the authority of His Majesty the Emperor of Russia. In Russia, the press has not the same influence on public opinion as in France. At best, its declarations are the barometer by which to gauge how much can be printed according to the Russian press laws. But they do not obligate the Russian government or His Majesty the Emperor of Russia in any way. In contrast with the voices of the Russian press, I have the immediate testimony of Emperor Alexander himself, when a few months ago I had the honour of being received by him in audience after the lapse of several years. I was then able to convince myself afresh that the Emperor of Russia harbours no hostile feelings against us, and does not intend to attack us, or to wage any aggressive wars at all. What the Russian press says, I do not believe. What Emperor Alexander says, I believe. I have absolute confidence in it. When both are in the scales, the testimony of the Russian press, with its hatred of Germany, rises as light as a feather, and the personal testimony of Emperor Alexander has the only effective weight, so far as I am concerned. I repeat, therefore, the press does not induce me to consider our relations with Russia to be worse today than they were a year ago. I now come to the other point, the allocation of the troops. It used to take place on a big scale, but only since 1879, when the Turkish War was concluded, has it assumed the proportions which today seem threatening. It may easily appear as if this accumulation of Russian troops near the German and Austrian frontiers where their support is more difficult and more expensive than further inland, could only be dictated by the intention of surprising and attacking one of the neighbours unprepared, sans de guerre. I cannot for the moment think of the German expression. Well, I do not believe this. In the first place, it would be contrary to the character of the sovereign and his own words, and secondly, its object could not be easily understood. Russia cannot intend to conquer any Prussian provinces, nor, I believe, any Austrian provinces. Russia has, I believe, as many Polish subjects as it cares to have, and has no desire to increase their numbers. To annex anything but Polish districts from Austria would be even more difficult. No reason exists, no pretence which could induce a European monarch suddenly to assail his neighbours. I even go so far in my confidence as to be convinced that a Russian war would not ensue if we should become involved in a French war, because of some explosive happenings in France which no one can foresee, and which surely are not intended by the present French government. A French war, on the other hand, would be an absolute certainty if we should be involved in a Russian war, for no French government would be so strong that it could prevent it, even if it was inclined to do so. But, as regards Russia, I still declare that I am not looking for an attack, and I take back nothing from what I said last year. You will ask, if that is so, what is the use of this expensive allocation of the Russian troops? That is one of the questions for which one can hardly expect an answer from a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, itself vitally interested. If we should begin to ask for explanations, we might receive forced replies, and our surrejoinders would also have to be forced. That is a dangerous path, which I do not like to tread. Allocations of troops are things for which one does not take the other country to task, asking for categorical explanations, but against which one takes counter-precautions with equal reserve and circumspection. I cannot, therefore, give an authentic declaration concerning the motives of this Russian allocation, but, having been familiar through a generation with foreign politics and the policy of Russia, I can form my own ideas concerning them. These ideas lead me to assume that the Russian cabinet is convinced, probably with good reason, that the weight of the Russian voice in the diplomatic Areopagus of Europe will be the weightier in the next European crisis, the stronger Russia is on the European frontier, and the farther west the Russian armies stand. Russia is more quickly at hand, either as an ally or as a foe, the nearer her main army, or at least a large army, is to her western frontier. This policy has directed the Russian allocation of troops for a long while. You will remember the army assembled in the Polish kingdom during the Crimean War was so large that this war might have ended differently if the army had started on time. If you think farther back, you will see that the events of 1830 found Russia unprepared and not ready to take a hand, because she had an insufficient number of troops in the western part of her empire. I need not, therefore, draw the conclusion from the accumulation of Russian troops in the western provinces, Zapadny Guberny, as the Russians say, that our neighbours mean to attack us. I assume they are waiting, possibly for another Oriental crisis, intending then to be in the position of pressing home the Russian wishes by means of an army situated, not exactly in Kazan, but farther west. When might such an Oriental crisis take place, you ask? Forsooth, we have no certainty. During this century we have had, I think, 4 crises, if I do not include the smaller ones, and those which did not culminate. One was in 1809, and ended with the treaty which gave Russia the Pruth frontier, and another in 1828. Then there was the Crimean War of 1854, and the War of 1877. They have happened, therefore, at intervals of about 20 years and over. Why, then, should the next crisis take place sooner than after a similar interval, or at about 1899, 20 years after the last one? I, for one, should like to reckon with the possibility of its being postponed, and not occurring immediately. Then there are other European events which are wont to take place at even intervals. The Polish uprisings, for instance. Formerly we had to expect one every 18 or 20 years. Possibly this is one reason why Russia wishes to be so strong in Poland that she may prevent them. Then there are the changes of government in France, which also used to happen every 18 or 20 years, and no one can deny that a change of government in France may bring about such a crisis that every interested nation may wish to be able to intervene with her full might. I mean only diplomatically, but with a diplomacy which is backed by an efficient army close at hand. I assume, on the strength of my purely technical diplomatic judgment, which is based on my experience, that these are the intentions of Russia, and that she has no wish to comply with the somewhat uncouth threats and boastings of the newspapers. And if this is so, then there is surely no reason why we should look more gloomily into the future now than we have done at any time during the past 40 years. The Oriental crisis is undoubtedly the most likely to occur, and in this our interests are only secondary. When it happens, we are in a position to watch whether the powers, who are primarily interested in the Mediterranean and the Levant, will make their decisions and come to terms, if they choose, or go to war with Russia about them. We are not immediately called upon to do either. Every great power which is trying to influence or to restrain the policies of other countries in matters which are beyond the sphere of its interests is playing politics beyond the bounds which God has assigned to it. Its policy is one of force and not of vital interests. It is working for prestige. We shall not do this. If Oriental crises happen, we shall wait before taking our position until the powers who have greater interests at stake than we have declared themselves. There is, therefore, no reason, gentlemen, that you should look upon our present situation with unusual gravity, assuming this to be the cause of our asking for the mighty increase of our armaments, which the military bill contemplates. I should like to separate the question of re-establishing the Landwehr of the second grade, in short, the big military bill and the financial bill, from the question of our present situation. It has to do, not with a temporary and transient arrangement, but with the permanent invigoration of the German Empire. That no temporary arrangement is contemplated will be perfectly clear, I believe, when I ask you to survey with me the dangers of war which we have met in the past 40 years without having become nervously excited at any one time. In the year 1848, when many dikes and floodgates were broken, which until then had directed the peaceful flow of countless waters,
we had to dispose of two questions freighted with the danger of war. They concerned Poland and Schleswig-Holstein. The first shouts after the Marshall days were, "War with Russia and the rehabilitation of Poland." Soon thereafter the danger was perilously near of being involved in a great European war on account of Schleswig-Holstein. I need not emphasize how the Agreement of Olmütz in 1850 prevented a great conflagration, a war on a gigantic scale. Then there followed 2 years of greater quiet, but of general ill-feeling, at the time when I was first ambassador in Frankfort. In 1853 the earliest symptoms of the Crimean War made themselves felt. This war lasted from 1853 to 1856, and during this whole time we were near the edge of the cliff, I will not say the abyss, whence it was intended to draw us into the war. I will remember that I was obliged at that time, from 1853 to 1855, to alternate like a pendulum, so to speak, between Frankfort and Berlin, because the late king, thanks to the confidence he had in me, used me as the real advocate of his independent policy whenever the insistence of the Western powers that we too should declare war on Russia grew too strong, and the opposition of his cabinet too flabby for his liking. Then the play was staged, I do not know how often, when I was called back here and ordered to write for His Majesty a more pro-Russian dispatch, and Mr. von Manteuffel resigned, and I requested to be instructed by His Majesty to follow Mr. von Manteuffel, after the dispatch was gone, into the country or anywhere else, and to induce him to resume his office. Yet each time Prussia, as it was then constituted, was hovering on the brink of a great war. It was exposed to the hostility of the whole of Europe except Russia, if it refused to join in the policies of the West European powers, and, if it did, it was forced to break with Russia, possibly for a very long while, because the defection of Prussia would probably have been felt very painfully in Russia. During the Crimean War, therefore, we were in constant danger of war. The war lasted till 1856, when it was at last concluded by the Treaty of Paris, and we found in the Congress of Paris a sort of Canossa prepared for us, for which I should not have assumed the responsibility, and against which I vainly counselled at the time. We were not at all obliged to play the part of a greater power than we were, and to sign the treaties made there, but we were dancing attendance with the view of being permitted to sign the treaty. This will not again happen to us. That was in 1856, and as early as in 1857 the problem of Neuchâtel was again threatening us with war. This did not become generally known. In the spring of that year I was sent to Paris by the late king to negotiate with Emperor Napoleon concerning the passage of Prussian troops in an attack upon Switzerland. Everyone who hears this from me will know what this would have meant in case of an understanding, and that it could have become a far-reaching danger of war, and might have involved us with France as well as with other powers. Emperor Napoleon was not unwilling to agree. My negotiations in Paris, however, were terminated because His Majesty the King, in the meanwhile, had come to an amicable understanding in the matter with Austria and Switzerland, but the danger of war, we must agree, was present also during that year. While I was on this mission in Paris, the Italian War hung in the air. It broke out a little more than a year later, and came very near drawing us into a big general war of Europe.
We went so far as to mobilize, and we should undoubtedly have taken the field if the peace of Villafranca had not been concluded somewhat prematurely for Austria, but just in time for ourselves, for we should have been obliged to wage this war under unfavourable circumstances. We should have turned this war, which was an Italian affair, into a Franco-Prussian war, and its secession, outcome, and treaty of peace would no longer have depended on us, but on the friends and enemies who stood behind us. Thus we came into the 60s without the clouds of war having cleared from the horizon for even one single year. Already in 1863, another war threatened hardly less ominously, of which the people at large know little, and which will only be appreciated when the secret archives of the cabinets will be made public. You may remember the Polish uprising of 1863, and I shall never forget the morning calls which I used to receive at that time from Sir Andrew Buchanan, the English ambassador, and Talleyrand, the French representative, who tried to frighten me out of my wits by attacking the Prussian policy for its inexcusable adherence to Russia, and who used rather a threatening language with me. At noon of the same days, I then used to have the pleasure of listening in the Prussian Diet to somewhat the same arguments and attacks which the foreign ambassadors had made upon me in the morning. I suffered it quietly, but Emperor Alexander lost his patience, and wished to draw his sword against the plotting of the Western powers. You will remember that the French forces were then engaged with American projects, and in Mexico, which prevented France from taking a vigorous stand. The Emperor of Russia was no longer willing to stand the Polish intrigues of the other powers, and was ready to face events in our company, and to go to war. You will remember that Prussia was struggling at that time with difficult interior problems, and that in Germany the Leaven had begun to work in the minds of the people, and the Council of the Princes, in Frankfort, was under contemplation. It may readily be granted, therefore, that the temptation for my gracious master was very strong to cut, and thus to heal, his difficult position at home by agreeing to a military undertaking on a colossal scale. At that time the war of Prussia and Russia together against those who were protecting the Polish insurrection against us would undoubtedly have taken place if His Majesty had not recoiled from the thought of solving home difficulties, Prussian as well as German, with foreign help. We declined in silence, and without revealing to the other German powers, who had hostile projects against us, the reasons which had determined our course. The subsequent death of the King of Denmark changed the trend of thought of everybody interested. But all that was needed to bring about the great coalition war in 1863 was a yes instead of a no from His Majesty the King in Gastein. Anybody but a German minister would perhaps have counselled affirmatively, for reasons of utility and opportunism, in order to solve thereby our home difficulties. You see, neither our own people nor foreigners really have a proper appreciation for the amount of national loyalty and high principles which guides both the sovereign and his ministers in the government of German states. The year 1864, we just spoke of 1863, brought a new pressing danger of war. From the moment when our troops crossed the Eider, I was ready every week to see the European Council of Elders interfere in this Danish affair, and you will agree with me that this was highly probable. But in those days we could observe that it is not so very easy for Europe to attack Austria and Prussia when they are united. And remember that the German Federation which supported these two states at that time, had not nearly the same military importance which the identical countries possess today. The difficulty of an attack on Austria and Prussia showed itself even then, but the danger of a war remained the same. In 1865 it faced about, and the preparations for the war of 1866 were beginning. I only remember a meeting of the Prussian cabinet which took place in Regensburg in 1865, with a view to procuring the necessary money, but which was rendered futile by the agreement of Gastein. In 1866, however, the war broke out in full force, as you know. A circumspect use of events alone enabled us to ward off the existing danger of turning this duel between Prussia and Austria into a fierce European war of coalition, when our very existence, our life and all we had, would have been at stake. This was in 1866, and in 1867 the Luxembourg problem arose, when only a somewhat firmer reply was needed to bring about the great French war in that year, and we might have given it if we had been so strong that we could have counted on a sure success. From then on, during 1868, 1869, and up to 1870, we were living in constant apprehension of war, and of the agreements which in the time of Mr. von Bust were being made in Salzburg and other places between France, Italy, and Austria, and which, we feared, were directed against us. The apprehension of war was so great at that time that I received calls. I was the president of the cabinet, from merchants and manufacturers who said, "The uncertainty is unbearable. Why don't you strike the first blow? War is preferable to this continued damper on all business." We waited quietly until we were struck, and I believe we did well to arrange matters so that we were the nation which was assailed, and were not ourselves the assailants. Now, since the great war of 1870 was waged, has there been a year, I ask you, without the danger of war? In the first years of the 70s, the very moment we came home, the question arose, when will be the next war? When will revenge be given? Within 5 years at the latest, no doubt? We were told, the question whether we shall have to fight, and with what success, surely rests with Russia nowadays. Russia alone holds the hilt. It was a representative of the Catholic party who thus remonstrated with me in the Reichstag. I may possibly revert to this subject later. In the meanwhile, I wish to complete the picture of the 40 years by saying that in 1876 the clouds of war again began to gather in the south. In 1877 the Balkan War was waged, which would have led to a conflagration of the whole of Europe if this had not been prevented by the Congress gathered in Berlin. After the Congress, an entirely new Eastern picture presented itself to us, for Russia was offended by our attitude in the Congress. I may revert to this later, if my strength permits. Then there followed a period when we felt the results of the intimate relations between the three emperors, which for some time permitted us to face the future with greater placidity. But at the first symptoms of any instability in the relations of the three emperors, or of the termination of the agreements which they had made with one another, public opinion was possessed by the same nervous and, I believe, exaggerated excitement with which we have had to contend these last years, and which I consider especially uncalled for today. From my belief that this excitement is uncalled for,
I am far from drawing the conclusion that we do not need an increase in our armaments. The very opposite is my view, and this may explain the tableau of 40 years which I have just exhibited before you. Possibly not for your enjoyment, and I ask your pardon. But if I had omitted even one of those years, which you yourselves have lived through, with trembling, you would not have received the impression that the state of apprehension of great wars is permanent with us. Great complications and all kinds of coalitions, which no one can foresee, are constantly possible, and we must be prepared for them. We must be so strong, irrespective of momentary conditions, that we can face any coalition with the assurance of a great nation which is strong enough under circumstances to take her fate in her own hands. We must be able to face our fate placidly with that self-reliance and confidence in God, which are ours when we are strong and our cause is just. And the government will see to it that the German cause will be just always. We must, to put it briefly, be as strong in these times as we possibly can be, and we can be stronger than any other nation of equal numbers in the world. I shall revert to this later, but it would be criminal if we were not to make use of our opportunity. If we do not need our full armed strength, we need not summon it. The only problem is the not very weighty one of money. Not very weighty, I say, in passing, because I have no wish to enter upon a discussion of the financial and military figures, and of the fact that France has spent 3 millions for the improvement of her armaments these last years, while we have spent scarcely 1.5 millions, including what we are asking of you at this time. But I leave the elucidation of this to the Minister of War and the representatives of the Treasury Department. When I say that it is our duty to endeavour to be ready at all times, and for all emergencies, I imply that we must make greater exertions than other people for the same purpose, because of our geographical position. We are situated in the heart of Europe, and have at least 3 fronts open to an attack. France only has her eastern, and Russia only her western frontier, where they may be attacked. We are also more exposed to the dangers of a coalition than any other nation, as is proved by the whole development of history, by our geographical position, and the lesser degree of cohesiveness which until now has characterized the German nation in comparison with others. God has placed us where we are prevented, thanks to our neighbours, from growing lazy and dull. He has placed by our side the most warlike and restless of all nations, the French, and he has permitted warlike inclinations to grow strong in Russia, where they formerly existed to a lesser degree. Thus we are given the spur, so to speak, from both sides, and are compelled to exertions which we should perhaps not be making otherwise. The pikes in the European carp pond are keeping us from being carps by making us feel their teeth on both sides. They are also forcing us to an exertion which without them we might not make, and to a union among Germans which is abhorrent to us at heart. By nature we are rather tending away, the one from the other, but the Franco-Russian press within which we are squeezed compels us to hold together, and by pressure our cohesive force is greatly increased. This will bring us to that state of being inseparable which all other nations possess, while we do not yet enjoy it. But we must respond to the intentions of Providence by making ourselves so strong that the pikes can do nothing but encourage us.
End of section 4. Section 5 of Speeches of Prince Bismarck, Part 2, by Otto von Bismarck, translated by Edmund von Mach. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Second half of We Germans Fear God and Nought Else in the World, February 6, 1888. Translated by Edmund von Mach, Ph.D. Formerly in the years of the Holy Alliance, I am just thinking of an American song which I learned of my late friend Motley, in good old colony times, when we lived under the king. Well, those were good old patriarchal times, when we had many posts to guide us, and many dikes to protect us from the wild floods of Europe. There were the German Union, and the real support and consummation of the German Union, the Holy Alliance. We had support in Russia and in Austria, and, above all, the guarantee of our diffidence, that we should never express an opinion before the others had spoken. All this we have lost. We must help ourselves. The Holy Alliance was wrecked in the Crimean War, not through our fault. The German Union has been destroyed by us, because the existence which we were granted within it was unbearable in the long run for ourselves and the German people as well. After the dissolution of the German Union and the War of 1866, Prussia, as it was then, or North Germany, would have become isolated, if we had been obliged to count with the fact that nobody would be willing to pardon our new successors, the great successes which we had won. No great power looks with favour on the successes of its neighbours. Our relations with Russia, however, were not disturbed by the experience of 1866. In that year the memory of Count Buol's policy, and of the policy of Austria during the Crimean War, was too fresh in Russia to permit the rise of the thought that Russia could assist the Austrian monarchy against the Prussian attack, or could renew the campaign which Emperor Nicholas had fought for Austria in 1849. I ask your pardon if I sit down for a moment. I cannot stand so long. Our most natural support, therefore, still remained with Russia, due very properly to the policy of Emperor Alexander I in this century, not to speak of the last century at all. In 1813 he might well have turned back at the Polish frontier and have made peace, and later he might have dropped Prussia. We certainly owed our re-establishment on the old basis at that time to the benevolence of Emperor Alexander I, or, if you wish to be sceptical, you may say the Russian policy, which was such as Prussia needed. Gratitude for this dominated the reign of Frederick William III. The credit, however, which Russia had in the Prussian accounts was used up by the friendship, I may even say servility, of Prussia during the entire reign of Emperor Nicholas, and was, I own, wiped out at Olmütz. There Emperor Nicholas did not take the part of Prussia, nor did he keep us from evil experiences or certain humiliations, for Emperor Nicholas really preferred Austria to Prussia. The idea that we owed Russia any thanks during his reign is a historical myth. We did, nevertheless, not break our traditional relations with Russia while he lived, and in the Crimean War we remained true, as I said before, to our Russian duty, in spite of many threats and great dangers. His Majesty the late King had no desire to play a decisive part in the war by a great levy of troops, as I believe we could have done. We had made certain treaties requiring us to put in the field 100,000 men,
after the lapse of a stated time, and I proposed to his Majesty to levy not 100,000 but 200,000 men, and mounted at that, whom we could use as well toward the right as toward the left, in which case, I said, your Majesty will be the arbiter of the Crimean War. But the late king did not cherish warlike enterprises, and the people ought to be grateful to him. I was younger then, and less experienced than I am today. At any rate, we harboured no resentment for Olmütz during the Crimean War. We came out of this war as the friends of Russia, and I was enabled to enjoy the fruit of this friendship when, as ambassador, I was most kindly received in St. Petersburg, both at court and in society at large. Even our espousing the cause of Austria in the Italian war, while not to the liking of the Russian cabinet, showed no harmful effects. Our war of 1866 was regarded in Russia with a certain amount of satisfaction, for the Russians were glad to see Austria suffer. In our French war of 1870, we were fortunate enough to be able to serve the Russian interests in the Black Sea at the same time that we were successful in defending and guarding our own. The contracting parties probably would not have removed their restrictions from the Black Sea if the victorious German troops had not been standing near Paris. If we had been beaten, the London Agreement in the interest of Russia would not have been made so easily, I believe. Thus, also, the War of 1870 carried in its train no disagreement between us and Russia. I mention these matters in order to explain to you the origin of our treaty with Austria, which was published a few days ago, and to defend His Imperial Majesty against the reproach of having enlarged the possibilities of war for the German Empire by adding to them the chances which may befall Austria, without any fault of her own. I am, therefore, going to describe to you how it happened that our traditional relations with Russia, which I had always and very gladly fostered, became so altered that we were induced to conclude the treaty published day before yesterday. The first years after the French War passed in the best of friendship. In 1875, there suddenly appeared the inclination of my Russian colleague, Prince Gortschakoff, to work for popularity with France rather than with us, and to make the world believe, by means of certain artificially created events and an interpolated telegram, that we harboured the idea, however remote, of invading France, and that his intercession alone had saved France from this danger. This occasioned the first estrangement between us, and led to a serious discussion between me and my former friend and later colleague. All this time, and subsequently, we were still clinging to the task of maintaining peace among the three emperors, and of continuing the relationship begun by the visits of the emperors of Russia and Austria here in Berlin in 1872, and the subsequent return visits. We were succeeding in this when, in 1876, before the Turkish War, pressure was brought to bear upon us to choose between Russia and Austria. This we refused to do. I do not deem it advantageous to discuss the details. They will be known some time. The result of our refusal was that Russia turned to Vienna directly and entered into an agreement with Austria. I believe it was in January 1877, concerning the possibilities of an Oriental crisis, granting her, if the crisis should take place, the occupation of Bosnia, etc. Then the war took place, and we were very glad that the storm raged further south than it had threatened at first. The war was definitely concluded here in Berlin by the Congress, after the preliminaries had been settled by the Peace of San Stefano. The Peace of San Stefano, I am convinced, was not more risky for the anti-Russian powers, nor much more favourable for Russia than the subsequent Congressional Treaty. The stipulations of San Stefano were realised, one might say, of their own accord later on, when the little state of East Rumelia, with only 800,000 souls, I believe, joined Bulgaria, and thereby re-established on its own responsibility the old San Stefano frontier, although not quite exactly. The damage, therefore, which the Congress inflicted on the agreements of San Stefano was not very considerable. Whether these agreements were masterpieces of diplomacy I leave undecided. We had then very little desire to mix in Oriental affairs, just as we have today. I was seriously ill in Fredericksruhe when I was officially notified of the Russian wish to call a congress of the great powers in Berlin for the definite settlement of the war. I was at first not favourably inclined, because I was physically incapacitated, and because I did not wish to involve ourselves in these matters to the extent which the presidency of a congress necessitates. My final compliance was partly due to the German sense of duty, which does anything in the interest of peace, and partly to the grateful memory of the favours of Alexander I, which I have always remembered, and which induced me to grant also this request. I declared my willingness, provided we could secure the acceptance of England and Austria. Russia undertook to secure the consent of England, and I agreed to recommend the plan in Vienna. We were successful, and the Congress took place. During the Congress, I may well say, I played my part, without hurting the interests of my country or of our friends, just as if I had been the fourth Russian plenipotentiary. I may almost say the third, for I can hardly accept Prince Gorchkov as a representative of the then Russian policy, which was more truly represented by Count Shuvalov. During the whole course of the congressional deliberations, I heard of no Russian wish which I did not recommend and push through. Thanks to the confidence which Lord Beaconsfield, unfortunately dead now, reposed in me, I called at his sickbed in the middle of the night during the most difficult and critical moments of the Congress, when disruption seemed near, and obtained his consent. In short, my behaviour in the Congress was such that I said to myself when it was over, if the highest Russian decoration set in diamonds had not been bestowed upon me long ago, I should surely receive it now. I had the feeling of having done something for a foreign power which is rarely vouchsafed to a foreign minister to do. What then were my surprise and natural disappointment, when gradually a sort of newspaper campaign began in St. Petersburg, attacking the German policy and casting suspicion on my personal intentions. These attacks increased in the following year to a strong request in 1879 for pressure to be exerted by us on Austria in matters where we could not attack the Austrian rights as such. I could not consent, for if we should have been estranged from Austria, we should necessarily have fallen into a dependence on Russia, unless we were satisfied with standing entirely alone in Europe. Would such a dependence have been bearable? Formerly I had believed it might be, when I had said to myself, we have no conflicting interests at all. There is no reason why Russia should ever cancel our friendship. At least I never contradicted my Russian colleagues when they expounded such theories to me. The Russian behaviour concerning the Congress disappointed me, and told me that we were not protected from being drawn into a conflict with Russia against our wishes, even if we placed our policy, for a time, completely at her disposal. The disagreement concerning instructions which we had given, or had not given, to our representatives in the South grew, until threats resulted, threats of war, from the most authoritative quarter. This is the origin of our Austrian treaty. By these threats we were compelled to choose between our two former friends, a decision which I had avoided through several decades. At that time I had negotiated in Gastein and in Vienna the treaty which was published day before yesterday, and which is in force between us today. The publication has been partly misunderstood in the newspapers, as I read yesterday and the day before. People have wanted to see in it an ultimatum, a warning, and a threat. A threat could not possibly be contained in it, since the text of the treaty has been known to Russia for a long while, and not only since November of last year. We considered it due to the sincerity of so loyal a monarch as the Emperor of Russia not to leave a doubt concerning the actual state of affairs. Personally, I see no chance for us not to have concluded this treaty. If we had not done it, we should have to do it now. It possesses the finest quality of an international treaty, in that it is the expression of the lasting interests of both parties, Austria as well as ourselves. No great power can for any length of time cling to the wording of a treaty against the interests of its own people. It will at last be forced to declare openly, "Times have changed, we can no longer do this," and it will have to defend its actions as best it can before its own people and the other contracting party. But no power will approve to a course which leads its own people to destruction for the sake of the letter of a treaty signed under different conditions. Nothing of this kind, however, is contained in these treaties. The treaty concluded with Austria, as well as other similar ones existing between us and other parties, notably some agreements into which we have entered with Italy, are the expression of common interests in mutual aspirations and dangers. Italy, like ourselves, has been obliged to fight against Austria for her right to establish her national union. At present both of us are living in peace with Austria, sharing with her the wish to ward off the dangers which are threatening all alike. Together we wish to preserve the peace, which is as dear to the one as to the other, and to protect our home, developments to which all of us are determined to devote ourselves. It is these aims, and the mutual confidence that the treaties will be kept, and that no one will grow more dependent by them than their own interests permit, which make these treaties firm, durable, and permanent. The extent to which our treaty with Austria is an expression of our mutual interests was shown at Nikolsburg and in 1870. Already during the negotiations of Nikolsburg, we were of the opinion that we could not do for any length of time without Austria in Europe, a strong and vigorous Austria. In 1870, when the war between ourselves and France broke out, many sensitive Austrians whom we had heard were naturally tempted to make use of this opportunity and to take revenge for 1866. The thoughtful and far-seeing diplomats, however, of the Austrian cabinet had to ask themselves, what will be the result? What will be our position if today we assist the French and help them to beat Prussia, or even Germany? What would have been the result if France, with the help of Austria, had been victorious over us? If Austria had followed such a policy, she could have had no other aim than to resume her former position in Germany, for this was really the only thing she had given up in 1866. There had been no other important conditions, and the pecuniary ones had been insignificant. Well then, what would have been the position of Austria as the presiding power in the German Union if she had to confess that in alliance with France she had taken from Germany the left bank of the Rhine, that she had reduced the South German states to a renewed dependence on France in the shape of a Rhenish federation, and had condemned Prussia to an irrevocable dependence on Russia, subject in future to the Russian policies? Such a position was unacceptable to all Austrian statesmen not completely blinded by wrath and vengeance. The same is also true with us in Germany. Imagine Austria struck from the map of Europe. Then we and Italy would be isolated on the continent, hemmed in between Russia and France, the two strongest military powers next to Germany, either continually one against two, and this would be the most probable, or alternately dependent on one or the other. But this will not be the case. It is impossible to imagine Austria away, for a state like Austria does not disappear. It is estranged if it is jilted, as was proposed in the Villafranca negotiations, and will be inclined to offer the hand to him who, on his part, has been the opponent of an unreliable friend. In short, if we wish to avoid being isolated, which is especially dangerous for Germany in our assailable position, we must have a reliable friend. Thanks to the similarities of our interests, and this treaty before you, we have two such friends. It is not love which makes them reliable, for nations may make war one upon the other because they hate, but it has never yet happened that one nation has sacrificed itself for the other for mere love. Nor do they always fight when they hate each other, for, if this were the case, France would have been fighting incessantly, not only with us, but also with England and Italy. She hates all her neighbours. I also believe that the Russian hatred of us, which has been artificially fanned, will not last. We are united with our allies in love of peace, not only by inclination and friendship, but also by the most cogent interests of a European equilibrium, and of our own future. For these reasons, I believe you will approve the Emperor's policy that has concluded the published treaty, although it increases the possibility of war. There can be no doubt that the passage of the pending bill will add much weight to the alliance which we have joined, and that the member which is represented by the German Empire will be immeasurably strengthened. The bill gives us an increase of trained troops, a possible increase of troops which we need not summon if we do not need them. We can leave the men at home, but having them in reserve, we shall also have the arms for them, and this is the all-important thing. I remember the old blunderbusses furnished in 1813 for our landwehr by England, with which I was drilled in the chasseurs. They were no weapons for war. Such we cannot furnish at a moment's notice. But, when once we have the proper weapons, this new bill means an increase of the guarantees of peace, and as strong an increase of the League of Peace as if a fourth great power had joined it with 700,000 men, which, as you know, used to be the maximum figure of a national army. This tremendous increase will also have a quieting effect, I believe, on our people, and will somewhat alleviate the nervousness of our public opinion and of our bankers and editors. I hope you will be relieved when you realize that after this increase, and from the very moment this bill is signed and published, the men will be ready. A scanty supply of arms for them might even now be at hand, but we must secure better ones, for if we form an army of triarians, of the best human material which we have among our people, men over 30 years of age and fathers of families, then we must have for them also the best arms that can be secured. We should not send them into battle with arms which we do not deem good enough for our regular troops. These staunch men, fathers of families, and gigantic figures, as we remember them from the time when they held the Bridge of Versailles, should carry on their shoulders the best of guns, and have the most complete armour and necessary clothing to ward off the hardships of the weather and other ills. In such matters we must not be saving. After listening to the survey of 40 years which I have just given, it is natural that our fellow citizens should realize the ever-present danger of a coalition against us, and the possibility of a double attack, in which I, to be sure, do not believe. The thought, however, that in such a case we can have 1,000,000 good soldiers for our defence on either frontier will be most reassuring to them. In addition, we can keep at home reserves of 500,000 and more, or even 1,000,000, sending them to the front as they may be needed. I have been told the result will be that the others will also increase their strength. This they cannot do, for they long ago reached their highest figure. We decreased our figures in 1867 because we believed that we could take things easy, with the North German alliance at our disposal, and could release from service all men over 32 years of age. Our neighbours subsequently adopted a longer period of service, many one as long as 20 years. The Minister of War will be able to explain this to you in more detail, if he will address you. In figures, the others are as strong as we, but in quality they cannot equal us. Courage is the same with all civilized nations. The Russian or the Frenchman fights as bravely as the German, but our people, our 700,000 men, are experienced, rompus au métier, trained soldiers who have not forgotten anything. In addition, no nation in the world can equal us in our material of officers and subalterns to direct such a huge army. This means the remarkable degree to which the popular education has spread in Germany, and which appears in no other country. The degree of education which is needed to qualify an officer and a subaltern to command, according to what the soldiers expect of them, is found with us far more extensively than elsewhere. We have more of the material out of which officers, and more out of which subalterns are made, than any other country, and we have a body of officers which no country in the world can equal. This, and the excellence of our subalterns, who are the pupils of our officers, constitute our superiority. The other nations cannot equal us in the amount of education which qualifies an officer to fulfill the severe requirements of his station, and of good comradeship to bear all the necessary privations, at the same time to satisfy the exceedingly difficult social demands which must be met if the feeling of good fellowship between officers and men, which, thank God, exists in our army to a high and often stirring degree, is to be established without detracting from the authority of the officers. The relations existing, especially in wartime, between our officers and men are inimitable, with a few evil exceptions which only prove the rule. For on the whole, we may say, no German officer forsakes his men under fire. He saves them at the risk of his life, and they do the same. No German soldier forsakes his officer. We have experienced this. If other nations are obliged to furnish with officers and subalterns equally large troops as we are intending to create by this bill, they may be forced by circumstances to appoint officers who will not succeed in guiding a company through a narrow gate, and even less in meeting the heavy obligations of the officer who is to retain the esteem and love of his men. The amount of education which is needed for this, and the amount of camaraderie and sense of honour which we find among our officers, can be elicited from no other body of officers anywhere in the world, either by rules or injunctions. In this we are superior to everybody, and that is why they cannot imitate us. I am therefore not at all afraid of it. Then there is another advantage if this bill is passed. The very strength at which we are aiming necessarily renders us pacific. This sounds like a paradox, but it is not. With the powerful engine into which we are transforming the German army, one does not make an attack. If I were to come before you today on the assumption that conditions were different from what I believe they are, and said, we are considerably menaced by France and Russia, it is to be expected that we shall be attacked, and as a diplomat, believing my military information in these matters to be correct, I am convinced that it is better for us to have our defence consist of a bold attack, and to strike the first blow now. And if I added, we can more easily wage an aggressive war, and I, therefore, am asking the Reichstag for an appropriation of 1,000,000 or 500,000 marks to engage in a war against two neighbours, then I do not know, gentlemen, whether you would have enough confidence in me to grant my request, but I would hope you would not have it. But if you had, it would not satisfy me. If we Germans wish to wage a war with the full effect of our national strength, it must be a war which satisfies all who take part in it, all who sacrifice anything for it, in short, the whole nation. It must be a national war, a war carried on the enthusiasm of 1870, when we were foully attacked. I still remember the ear-splitting, joyful shouts in the station at Cologne. It was the same all the way from Berlin to Cologne. In Berlin itself, the waves of popular approval bore us into the war, whether or no we wished it. That is the way it must be, if a popular force like ours is to show what it can do. It will, however, be very difficult to prove to the provinces and the imperial states and their inhabitants that the war is unavoidable and has to be. People will ask, are you so sure? Who can tell? In short, when we make an attack, the whole weight of all imponderables, which weigh far heavier than material weights, will be on the side of our opponents whom we have attacked. France will be bristling with arms way down to the Pyrenees. The same will take place everywhere. A war into which we are not born by the will of the people will be waged, to be sure, if it has been declared, by the constituted authorities who deemed it necessary. It will even be waged pluckily, and possibly victoriously, after we have smelled fire and tasted blood. But it will lack from the beginning the nerve and enthusiasm of a war in which we are attacked. In such a one, the whole of Germany from Memel to the Alpine lakes will flare up like a powder mine. It will be bristling with guns, and no enemy will dare to engage this furor Teutonicus, which develops when we are attacked. We cannot afford to lose this factor of preeminence, even if many military men, not only ours, but others as well, believe that today we are superior to our future opponents. Our own officers believe this to a man, naturally. Every soldier believes this. He would almost cease to be a useful soldier if he did not wish for war, and did not believe that we would be victorious in it. If our opponents by any chance are thinking that we are pacific because we are afraid of how the war may end, they are mightily mistaken. We believe as firmly in our victory in a just cause as any foreign lieutenant in his garrison, after his third glass of champagne, can believe in his. And we probably do so with greater certainty. It is not fear, therefore, which makes us pacific, but the consciousness of our strength. We are strong enough to protect ourselves, even if we should be attacked at a less favourable moment, and we are in a position to let divine providence determine whether a war in the meanwhile may not become unnecessary after all. I am, therefore, not in favour of any kind of an aggressive war, and if war could result from our attack, Somebody must kindle a fire. We shall not kindle it. Neither the consciousness of our strength, which I have described, nor our confidence in our tactics will prevent us from continuing our former endeavours to preserve peace. In this we do not permit ourselves to be influenced by annoyances or dislikes, the threats and insults, and the challenges which have been made have, no doubt, excited also with us a feeling of irritation which does not easily happen with Germans, for they are less prone to the national hatred than any other nation. We are, however, trying to calm our countrymen, and we shall work for peace with our neighbours, especially with Russia, in the future as well as in the past. When I say especially with Russia, I express the opinion that France is offering us no assurances of success in our endeavours. I will, however, not say that these endeavours are of no use. We shall never pick a quarrel, nor ever attack France. And in the many little incidents which the liking of our neighbours for spying and bribing has occasioned, we have always brought about a very courteous and amicable settlement. I should consider it criminal if we were to inflame a great national war for such bagatelles. These are the instances when one should say, the cleverer of the two will yield. I am referring, therefore, especially to Russia, and here I have the same confidence of success which I expressed a year ago, and which this liberal sheet printed in such large type, without any running after, or as a German paper very vulgarly called it, kowtowing to Russia. That time has passed. We no longer sue for love, either in France or in Russia. The Russian press and the Russian public opinion have shown the door to an old, powerful, and reliable friend, which we were. We do not force ourselves on anybody. We have tried to re-establish the old intimate relations, but we are running after nobody. This does not prevent us, however, from observing the treaty rights which Russia has with us. On the contrary, it is an incentive to us to do so. These treaty rights comprise some which not all our friends recognize as such. I mean the rights concerning Bulgaria, which we won for Russia in the Congress of Berlin, and which were not contested until 1885. There is no question for me, who was instrumental in preparing the congressional decisions, and who joined in signing them, that all of us were of the opinion at that time that Russia should have a predominating influence in Bulgaria, after the latter had renounced East Rumelia, and she herself had given the modest satisfaction of reducing, by 800,000 souls, the extent of the territory under her influence until it included only about 3 million people. Following this interpretation of the Congress, Russia, until 1885, appointed the prince, a close relative of the imperial house, of whom at that time nobody believed, or could believe, that he would wish to be anything but a faithful adherent of the Russian policy. Russia nominated the Minister of War and a great many officers. In short, it was governing in Bulgaria. There was no doubt of this. The Bulgarians, or some of them, or the prince, I do not know which, were not satisfied with it. A coup d'etat took place, a defection from Russia. Thus an actual condition has ensued, which we are not called upon to remedy by a recourse to arms, but which cannot in theory alter the rights which Russia took home from the Congress of Berlin. Whether there will be difficulties if Russia should wish to procure her rights by force, I do not know. We shall neither support nor counsel violent means, nor do I believe that they are being contemplated. I am quite sure they are not. If, however, Russia should try her luck along diplomatic lines, possibly by suggesting the intercession of the Sultan, the suzerain of Bulgaria, I deem it the duty of a loyal German policy to cling to the decisions of the Congress of Berlin, and to interpret them as all of us, without an exception, interpreted them at the time. The public feeling of Bulgarians can alter nothing in this, so far as I am concerned. Bulgaria, the tiny little country between the Danube and the Balkans, is not an object of sufficient size, I assure you, to attach to it any importance, or push Europe, for its sake, into a war, from Moscow to the Pyrenees, from the North Sea to Palermo, when no one can foresee its end. After the war, we would conceivably not even know for what we had been fighting. I may therefore declare that the hostility against us shown in the Russian public opinion, and especially in the Russian press, will not deter us from supporting, at Russia's request, any diplomatic steps she may take to regain her influence in Bulgaria. I intentionally say, at her request. Formerly, we have at times endeavoured to fulfil her wishes when they had only been confidentially suggested, but we have seen that some Russian papers immediately tried to prove that these very steps of the German diplomacy had been the most inimical to Russia. They actually attacked us for having fulfilled the wishes of Russia even before they had been expressed. We did this also in the Congress of Berlin, but it will not happen again. If Russia will officially request us to support with the Sultan as suzerain of Bulgaria the steps which she may take in her desire to re-establish in Bulgaria conditions according to the decisions of the Congress, I shall not hesitate to advise His Majesty the Emperor to do so. Our sense of loyalty to our neighbour demands this, for we should cherish neighbourly relations with him, let the present feelings be what they may. Together we should protect the monarchical institutions which are common to both of us, and set our faces in the interest of order against the opponents of it in Europe. Russia's monarch, moreover, fully understands that these are the duties of allied monarchs. If the Emperor of Russia should find that the interests of his great empire of 100 million people demand war, he will wage it, I do not doubt. But I do not believe that these interests can possibly demand a war against us, nor do I believe that these interests demand war at the present time at all. To sum up, I do not believe in an immediate interruption of peace, and I ask you to discuss this bill independently of such a thought or apprehension, looking upon it as a means of making great strength which God has placed in the German nation fully available. If we do not need all the troops, it is not necessary to summon them. We are trying to avoid the contingency when we shall need them. This attempt is as yet made rather difficult for us by the threatening newspaper articles in the foreign press, and I should like to admonish these foreign editors to discontinue such threats. They do not lead anywhere. The threats which we see made, not by the governments, but by the press, are really incredibly stupid, when we stop to reflect that the people making them imagine they could frighten the proud and powerful German Empire by certain intimidating figures made by printer's ink and shallow words. People should not do this. It would be easier for us to be more obliging to our two neighbours. Every country, after all, is sooner or later responsible for the windows which its press has smashed. The bill will be rendered some day, and will consist of the ill feeling of the other country. We are easily influenced, perhaps too easily, by love and kindness, but quite surely never by threats. We Germans fear God, and naught else in the world. It is this fear of God which makes us love and cherish peace. If, in spite of this, anybody breaks the peace, he will discover that the ardent patriotism of 1813, which called to the standards of the entire population of Prussia, weak, small, and drained to the marrow as it was then, has today become the common property of the whole German nation. Attack the German nation anywhere, and you will find it armed to a man, and every man with the firm belief in his heart, God will be with us.
End of section 5, read by Alister, Geraldton, on the 13th of December, 2023. Section 6 of Speeches of Prince Bismarck, Part 2, by Otto von Bismarck, translated by Edmund von Mach. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mount the guards at the Warthe and the Vistula. September 16th, 1894. Translated by Edmund von Mach, Ph.D. On September 16th, 1894, when Bismarck was no longer Chancellor, 2,200 Germans from the province of Posen appeared in Varzin to thank him for his devoted work in the service of the national idea, and to gather courage from him in their fight against the Polish propaganda which had gained strength under the new regime at court. The aged farm manager, Mr. Kenneman, was the leader and spokesman of the visitors.
Gentlemen, first I must ask your indulgence, since for 2 days I have been upset by an unpolitical enemy called Lumbago, an old acquaintance of mine for 60 years. I hope to get the better of him soon, and then to be able to stand again fully erect. At present I must confess I am hampered by him. I begin by replying to the words of the previous speaker with thanks for the honour done me, addressing myself first of all to him, but also to you. The previous speaker is as old as I. We were both born in 1815, and different walks of life have brought us together again here in Varzin, after almost 80 years. The meeting gives me great pleasure, although I have not run my course as safe and sound as Mr. Kenneman. When I claim to be an invalid of hard work, he may perhaps claim the same. But his work was possibly healthier than mine, this being the difference between the farmer and the diplomat. The mode of life of the latter is less healthy and more nerve-wracking. To begin with, then, I am grateful to you, gentlemen, and I should be even more grateful if we were all to put on our hats. I have lost in the course of years nature's own protection, but I cannot well cover my head if you do not do the same. I thank you that you have spared no exertion to show your national sentiments in this way. The exertion was considerable. A night in the train, a second night on the way back, insufficient meals, and inconveniently crowded cars. The fact that you have stood all this, and were not deterred by it, attests the strength of your national feeling, which impelled you to bear witness to it here. That you did it here greatly honours me, and I recognize it in your appreciation of my part in the work of establishing the conditions which we are enjoying in Germany today, after years of disunion. These conditions may be imperfect, but the best is the enemy of the good. At the time when we shaped these conditions, we never asked, what may we wish, but what must we have? This moderation in our demands for union was one of the most important preliminaries of success. By following this path, we have reached the results which have strengthened the pledge that your home will remain united with the German Empire and the Kingdom of Prussia. The proportion, in the meanwhile, of the Germans in the foundation of our structure to the less reliable, I will not say loose, Polish element, has become decidedly more favourable for the Germans. Our national figures are 48 million Germans and 2 million Poles, and in such a community the wishes of the 2 million cannot be decisive for the 48 million. As must be apparent, especially in an age when political decisions are dependent on a majority vote as a last resort. The forces which guarantee the union of these territories are strong enough, both in the Parliament and in the army, to assure it, and no one can doubt that the proper authorities are ready to use these forces at the right time. No one mistakes the meaning when the announcement is made from the highest quarters, "Ere we shall yield again Alsace, our army will have to be annihilated," and words to this effect have been spoken. The same thing is true, to an even greater degree, of our eastern frontier. We can spare neither, Posen even less than Alsace, and we shall fight, as the Emperor has said, to the last man before we renounce Alsace, this protection of our southern states. Yet Munich and Stuttgart are not more endangered by a hostile position in Strasbourg and Alsace than Berlin would be endangered by a hostile position near the Oder. It may, therefore, be readily assumed that we shall remain firm in our determination and sacrifice, if it should become necessary, our last man and the last coin in our pockets for the defence of the German eastern frontier, as it has existed for 80 years. And this determination will suffice to render the union between your province and the Empire as positively assured as things can be in this world. We confined our demands to what was necessary for our existence, and what enabled the big European nation, which we are, to draw a free breath. We did not include territories where German used to be spoken, when this had largely been due to a propaganda of the German courts. More German used to be spoken in the east, northeast, and elsewhere than today. Remember our ally Austria, and how familiar German was there in the days of Joseph II and of the Empress Maria Theresa, when German was a greater force in parts of Hungary than it is, or can be, today. But for everything we gave up in the shape of a linguistic and outward union, we have found rich compensation in the intensity of a closer union. If the older gentlemen will think back to the time before Emperor Wilhelm I, they will realize that the lack of love among the various German tribes was much greater at that time than it is today. We have made notable progress in this direction, and when we compare the unequivocal expressions of opinion from Bavaria and Saxony today with the familiar sentiments of earlier times, we must say that Germany, which for the past 100 years had lagged behind the other peoples of Europe in national development, has rapidly caught up with them. 40 years ago we were far behind all other nations in national feeling and love of one another. Today we are no longer behind them. Our fellow countrymen from the Rhine, from the Alpine Lake and the Saxon Elbe, are attached to one another in affectionate sympathy, not only when they meet abroad, but also at home. A united people has been created in a remarkably short time. This proves that the medical cure which we employed, although it was of blood and iron, lanced only a sore, which had come to a head long ago, and that it gave us speedy comfort and good health. God grant that the cure will be long-lasting, and subject to no change. How far-reaching it is has been proved by the testimonials which I have received since I gave up my office. They have come from all people, from Baden, Bavaria, Saxony, Swabia, Hessen, and from all the districts of Prussia outside the provinces of Frederick the Great. these entirely voluntary manifestations, which were arranged by no one, and which, not infrequently, came to me at rather inconvenient and inopportune times, have impressed me with the existence of national harmony. Every one of them has given pleasure to my patriotic heart, and has borne witness to a common feeling existing in all German races. This much I wish to say concerning the stability of the political and national union of your province today. We often sing, "Firm is the stand of the faithful guards on the Rhine," but they are standing equally firm at the Warthe and the Vistula. We cannot spare an acre of land in either direction, for the sake of principle, if nothing else. The previous speaker referred to the attempts which had been made, as a result of the movement of 1848, to shake loose the union in which we were then living in Prussia and Germany, and to disregard our boundary lines. These attempts of satisfying the wishes of our Polish neighbours ended with the action of the Prussian General von Kolm, who closed the gates of Posen to the Polish troops which, in response to promises made in Berlin, had been raised under the Prussian General von Willison. We were obliged to conquer with Prussian troops, and in a bloody war, the army of the insurgents who fought bravely and honourably. I wish to add that even that war was not fought with the Polish people as such, but with the Polish nobility and their following. I remember speaking to some Polish soldiers of the 19th Regiment, I believe, in Erfurt at that time, that is, in 1850, who called the opponents only kormaniks, the Polish word for contract labourers. We should, then, not deceive ourselves into believing that even today the number of those who are opposed to the two races in Posen and in West Prussia, living together peacefully, is as large as statistics may claim. This brings me to the second point touched upon by the previous speaker, the two races living together peacefully. I believe that many of you have in your employ labourers and servants who speak Polish, and that you are of the opinion that no danger comes from this lower social stratum of the population. Living together with them is possible, and no disturbance of the peace starts with them. They do not promote any movements hostile to us. I do not even mention the fact that they are possibly of another race than the nobility, whose immigration into the Slavic districts is lost in the obscure past. The statistical numbers, therefore, of those opposed to a peaceful communion of both races must be lessened by the number of labourers and farmers. The lower classes are, in the bulk, satisfied with the Prussian government, which may not be perfect always, but which treats them with greater justice than they were accustomed to in the times of the Polish Republic of Nobles. They are satisfied with this. It was not part of my programme that the Commission on Colonization should pay special attention to small holdings of German-speaking settlers. The Polish peasants are not dangerous, nor does it make any difference whether the labourers are Polish or German. The chief thing was to create crown lands among the big estates, and to rent them to men whom the state could permanently influence. The desire for quick sales and colonization emanated from other competent quarters than myself. It was impossible for me to supervise these measures after I had instigated them. The difficulties which I met in the 40 years of my Polish diplomacy did not start with the masses of Polish labourers and peasants, but were, I believe, occasioned largely, if not exclusively, by the Polish nobility with the assistance of the Polish clergy. Perhaps this latter term is too narrow, for I know of instances when German priests assisted in the Polish propaganda for the sake of peace. This is the peculiarity of our race, and I do not exactly wish to condemn it, that we often place our religion above our nationality. The very opposite is true of our opponents, the Poles and the French people, who regard their nationality more highly than their religion. We are suffering from this habit. We possess, however, a certain material counterweight, provided the state government unreservedly supports the German element. The religious element has great weight in the family circle, and among women, especially the Polish women, who I have always greatly admired. The minister has freer access to them than the local governor or the judge. There will, however, always be a powerful weight in the scales when the Prussian government exercises its influence with firm determination, and so clearly that doubts for the future are impossible. Vestigia terrent, we may say, when, with 1848, no, not 1848, I mean 1831-32, the attention paid to the Polish nation became almost more pronounced in Germany than that given to the German element. Since then, we have surely been able to register progress in our politics. Now, I must ask your indulgence for a moment on account of my lumbago.
Sit down.
Sitting down does not help me. I know this visitor from years of experience. I was speaking of the possibility of having the two races living peacefully side by side. This is not impossible, for in Switzerland we see 3 different nationalities. The German, Italian, and French-Swiss deliberate quietly and without bitterness on matters of joint interest. In Belgium we see the Germanic Flemish form a united state with the Gallic Walloons, and we perceive that it is possible under circumstances to live peacefully together, even with the Poles. When we remember East Prussia, where the Polish messieurs, the Lithuanians, and the Germans work together harmoniously, because nobody has incited the people there, no national ill-feeling has appeared among them. It is true, to be sure, that the Catholic priest, with his peculiar interests, is unknown there, but look at your neighbours in Upper Silesia. Have the two races not lived there in peaceful communion for centuries, although the religious differences exist there also? What is it, then, that Silesia has not, that has made it possible for us to live there, through centuries, in religious harmony? I am sorry to have to say it, but it is the Polish nobility and the clergy of the Polish propaganda. The Polish nobles are, no doubt, very influential, more so with the Poles than the Germans, but the statistical figures are much larger than the actual number of our aggressive Polish opponents, with whom we have to count. The nobles are thinking of the time when they were all-powerful, and they cannot give up the memory of conditions when they ruled the king as well as the peasants. The Polish nobles, however, are surely too highly educated to believe that the conditions of the old Polish Republic of nobles could ever return, and I should be astonished if the Polish peasants knew the history of Poland so badly that they did not recoil from the possibility of a return to the old state of affairs. The peasants must say to themselves that a wet year, as the farmers put it, would be their lot if the nobles regained their power. Among the national Polish representatives that are elected, you generally meet only noblemen. At least I cannot remember having seen a Polish farmer as a representative in the Reichstag, or in the Diet. Compare this with the election results in German districts. I do not even know whether there are Polish burghers in our sense of the word. The middle classes in the Polish cities are poorly developed. Consequently, when we reduce our opponents to their proper size, we grow more courageous in our own determination, and I should be very glad if I could encourage those who on their part are adding to the encouragement of the Polish nobles. I feel, gentlemen, that I am of one mind with you, who have travelled the hard road hither. I have no influence with other elements, but we shall not give up hope in spite of all vicissitudes." The address of the previous speaker also referred to vicissitudes and changes. These changes have characterized our entire Polish policy from 1815 till today. They took place whenever high Polish families gained influence at court. You all know the Radziwill family, and its influence at the court of Frederick William IV. If we could make a mental test of the popular feeling of 1831 and of today, we should find the conviction has greatly increased that we have German fellow countrymen in the Grand Duchy of Posen. The former, and I am tempted to say childish cult of the Poles, as I knew it in my childhood, is no longer possible. Then we were taught Polish songs in our music lessons, together with the Marseillaise, to be sure. The Polish nobleman, therefore, than whom God never created anything more reactionary, was here thrown into one pot with the French Revolution, and liberalism was coupled with the cause of the Poles, because we were lacking in political perspicacity. Such feelings were ingrained in our citizens at that time. I am thinking especially of the citizens of Berlin. If today you ask the opinion of your 48 million fellow countrymen, and compare their views and those of the bulk of the German army with the bugbear which had found lodging in German hearts at the time of Platten's Polish songs, you surely cannot despair of further development. We may, you must agree, register progress, although it is slow and there are lapses. It is like climbing on a sandy hill, or walking in the lava of Mount Vesuvius. One often glides back, but on the whole one is advancing. Your position will grow the stronger, the more vigorously developed our sense of nationality will become. I ask of you, do not despair if there are clouds in the sky, especially in this rainy year which has saddened the farmers. They will disappear, and the union of the Warthe and the Vistula with Germany is irrefragable. For centuries we have existed without Alsace-Lorraine, but no one yet has dared to think what our existence would be if today a new kingdom of Poland were founded. Formerly it was a passive power. Today it would be an active enemy supported by the rest of Europe. As long as it would not have gained possession of Danzig, Thorn, and West Prussia, and I know not what else the excitable Polish mind might crave, it would always be the ally of our enemies. It indicates, therefore, insufficient political skill or political ignorance if we rely in any way on the Polish nobles for the safety of our eastern frontier, or if we think that we can win them to fight anywhere for German possessions sword in hand. This is a utopian idea. The only thing which we, and you gentlemen, can do under present conditions, and which we can learn from the Poles, is to cling to one another. The Poles, too, have parties, and used to show this even more unfortunately than we. But all their parties disappear as soon as a national question is broached. I wish the same would come to be true of us, and that in national questions we would belong primarily, not to a party, but to the nation. Let us be of as divergent opinions as we choose, but when in our eastern provinces the question arises, German or Polish, then let the party feuds be laid aside until, as the Berliners say, after 9 o'clock. Now is the time to fight and to stand together. This is just as it is in military matters, and I am glad to see among you many who have experience in such things. Before joining an attack in war, we do not ask, shall we follow our progressive or our reactionary neighbour? We advance when the drum beats the signal, and so we should in national affairs forget all party differences, and form a solid phalanx hurling all our spears, reactionary, progressive, and despotic alike, against the enemy. If we agree on this, and the dangers of the future are compelling us to do so, we shall win our women and children for the same strict sense of nationality. And if our women are with us, and our youths, we are saved for all time. This is one of our present tasks, to give a national education to our children. I am confident that the German women possess all the necessary qualifications for this task. I shall ask you, therefore, to join me in a toast. The German women in the Grand Duchy of Posen, and may the German idea take an even firmer hold in your country.
End of section 6. Read by Alister, Geraldton, 20th of October 2023. Section 7 of Speeches of Prince Bismarck, Part 2, by Otto von Bismarck, translated by Edmund von Mach. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Long live the Emperor and the Empire. April 1st, 1895. Translated by Edmund von Mach, Ph.D. The 80th birthday of Prince Bismarck was celebrated as a national holiday everywhere in Germany. Not less than 5,250 youths from the universities and academies visited Friedrichsruhe on April 1st to bear witness before the old man of Germany to their love for the Emperor and the Empire. After receiving a delegation from the faculties of all the universities, Bismarck addressed the students as follows. Gentlemen, I have heard from the lips of your teachers, the leaders of higher education, an appreciation of my past, which means much to me. From your greeting I infer a promise for the future, and this means even more for a man of my years than his love of approbation. You will be able, at least many of you, to live according to the sentiments which your presence here today reveals, and to do so to the middle of the next century, while I have long been condemned to inactivity and belong to the days that are past. I find consolation in this observation, for the German is not so constituted that he could entirely dismiss in his old age what in his youth inspired him. 40 and 60 years hence, you will not hold exactly the same views as today, but the seed planted in your young hearts by the reign of Emperor William I will bear fruit, and even when you grow old, your attitude will ever be German national, because it is so today, whatever form our institutions may have taken in the meanwhile. We do not wilfully dismiss from our hearts the love of national sentiments. We do not lose them when we emigrate. I know instances of hundreds of thousands of Germans from America, South Africa, and Australia who are today bound to the fatherland with the same enthusiasm which carried many of them to the war. We had to win our national independence in difficult wars. The preparation, the prologue, was the Holstein War. We had to fight with Austria for a settlement. No court of law could have given us a decree of separation. We had to fight. That we were facing a French war after our victory at Zadova could not remain in doubt for anyone who knew the conditions of Europe. It was, however, desirable not to wage this war too soon, nor before we had garnered to some extent the fruits of our North German Union. After the war had been waged, everybody here was saying that within 5 years we should have to wage the next war. This was to be feared, it is true, but I have ever since considered it to be my duty to prevent it. We Germans had no longer any reason for war. We had what we needed.
to fight for more, from a lust of conquest, and for the annexation of countries which were not necessary for us, always appeared to me like an atrocity. I am tempted to say, like a Bonapartistic and foreign atrocity alien to the German sense of justice. Consequently, since we rebuilt and enlarged our house, according to our needs, I have always been a man of peace. Nor have I shrunk from small sacrifices. The strong man can afford to yield at times. Neither the Caroline Islands nor Samoa were worth a war, however much stress I have always laid on our colonial development. We did not stand in need of glory won in battles, nor of prestige. This, indeed, is the superiority of the German character over all others, that it is satisfied when it can acknowledge its own worth, and has no need of recognition, authority, or privilege. It is self-sufficient. This is the course I have steered, and in politics it is much easier to say what one should avoid than what one should do. Certain principles of honesty and courage forbid one to do certain things, just as the access to certain fields is interdicted in the army manoeuvres. But the decision as to what has to be done is a very different matter, and no one can be sure of it beforehand. For politics are a task which can be compared only to the navigation of unknown waters. One does not know what the weather will be, or how the currents will flow, nor what storms will be raging. There is in politics this additional factor of uncertainty, that one is largely dependent on the decisions of others on whom one has counted, and who have failed. One never can act with complete independence. And when our friends whose assistance we need, although we cannot guarantee it, change their minds, our whole plan has failed. Positive enterprises are, therefore, very difficult in politics, and when they succeed you should be grateful to God who has given you his blessing, and not find fault with details which one or the other may regret, but accept the situation as God has made it. For man cannot create or direct the stream of time. He can sail on it and steer his craft with more or less skill, be stranded and shipwrecked, or make a favourable port. Since we have now made a favourable port, as I conclude from the predominant, although not unanimous opinion of my countrymen, whose approval is all we have worked for, let us be satisfied, and let us keep and cherish what we have won in an emperor and an empire as it is, and not as some individuals may wish it should be, with other institutions, and a little bit more of this or that religious or social detail that they may have at heart. Let us be careful to keep what we have, lest we lose it because we do not know how to appreciate it. Germany was once a powerful empire under the Carolingians, the Saxons, and the Hohenstaufens. And when she lost her place 600 years past, before she regained the use of her legs, if I may say so, political and geological developments are equally slow. Layers are deposited, one on the other, forming new banks and new mountains. But I should like to ask especially the young gentlemen, do not yield too much to the German love of criticism. Accept what God has given us, and what we have toiled to garner, while the rest of Europe, I cannot say attacked us, but ominously stood at attention. It was not easy. If we had been cited before the European Council of Elders, before our French affairs were settled, we should not have fared nearly so well, and it was my task to avoid this if I possibly could. It is natural that not everything which everybody wished could be obtained under these conditions, and I mention this only to claim the indulgence of those who are perfectly justified in expecting more, and possibly in striving for more. But above everything, do not be premature, and do not act in haste. Let us cling for the present to what we have. The men who made the biggest sacrifices that the Empire might be born were undoubtedly the German princes, not excluding the King of Prussia. My old master hesitated long before he voluntarily yielded his independence to the Empire. Let us then be thankful to the reigning houses who made sacrifices for the Empire, which after the full 1,000 years of German history must have been hard for them to make. And let us be thankful to science and those who cultivate her for having kept alive on their hearths the fire of German unity to the time when new fuel was added, and it flamed up and provided us with satisfying light and warmth. I would then, and you will say that I am an old conservative man, compress what I have said into these words. Let us keep above everything the things we have, before we look for new things, nor be afraid of those people who begrudge them to us. In Germany, struggles have existed always, and the party schisms of today are naught but the echoes of the old German struggle between the noble families and the trade unions in the cities, and between those who had and those who had not in the peasant wars, in the religious wars, and in the 30 Years' War. None of these far-reaching fissures, which I am tempted to call geological, can disappear at once. And should we not be indulgent with our opponents if we ourselves do not desist from fighting? Life is a struggle everywhere in nature, and without inner struggles we end by being like the Chinese and become petrified. No struggle, no life. Only in every fight where the national question arises, there must be a rallying point. For us, this is the Empire, not as it may seem to be desirable, but as it is, the Empire and the Emperor who represents it. That is why I ask you to join me in wishing well to the Emperor and the Empire. I hope that in 1950, all of you who are still living will again respond with contented hearts to the toast, "Long live the Emperor and the Empire."
End of Section 7. End of Speeches of Prince Bismarck, Part 2, by Otto von Bismarck, translated by Edmund von Mach. Read by Alister, Geraldton, 30th of September 2023,